He is rank SSS, the highest the system has ever issued.
Treason against the Holy Kingdom.
I did not fight back. I had a reason. Within a month, the Empire would not function.
The summoning circle was bigger than I expected. So was the room. So was the king's contempt for the three of us with the wrong class titles. There were 12 of us when we landed in that throne room. 9 girls, 3 boys. The girls had skill names that sounded important. Saint, Archmage, Chronomancer. My class title read High School Boy. That was the entire entry. No skill list, no description, as if the system had looked at me, decided there was nothing to say, and moved on. The king delivered the verdict in the kind of voice you use when you have already decided something and are explaining it to a room. The girls would stay, the boys would not. We were given a magic bag, a sack of gold, and the suggestion that we leave the castle by sundown. I caught Haruto's eye. He looked terrified. Mamoru looked calculating. I, by my own account afterward, looked exactly like a boy who had been told he was unnecessary and was filing it for later. We left. The slave market took us about an hour. The slave exchange tickets we found in our magic bag were the lowest grade available, and the lowest grade available bought you people who were already half gone. 3 near corpses. A white fox beast girl whose eyes had been gouged out. A rabbit girl whose ribs were broken. A demon soldier who had not eaten in days. My holy maiden skills, as it turned out, did not care about class titles. I healed all 3 of them in the inn, while Mamoru watched the door. It took less mana than warming a kettle. They woke up. We learned their names. Sharon, Marnie, Shuramaru. They learned, slowly and with some convincing, that the people who had bought them were not planning to use them. We left the kingdom the following week with a merchant caravan. Months on a wagon road. Sea bug economies in coastal towns where children fished up shrimp and sold them for nothing because nobody knew what shrimp was. Sunken dungeons we cleared on the way north because they were there and the children wanted to see what was inside. By the time we reached the Empire, we were 6. The Empire was where I stopped traveling and started building. The Emperor had been our caravan escort in disguise. A piece of information I learned the day I revealed I could produce holy water at a fraction of the church's rate, in front of his entire court by accident. He gave me a house. He gave me wasteland. He sent over an advisor named Estura, who took one look at our living arrangements and began rearranging things with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for an excuse. Sharona managed the money. There was a lot of money to manage by then, and I did not have the temperament to manage it. The salon was hers more than mine. The clinic was something the city had not asked for and could not let go. 8 employees. A dormitory that smelled like rice in the mornings. An orphanage where 2 former stowaway children sent half their wages back to the orphanage in the city we had left. Operations, routines, a life. The Holy Kingdom's church, whose holy water monopoly I had quietly destroyed by selling at fair prices, did not respond. Not for weeks. Estora kept telling me, in the voice she used when she was being patient with me, that they would. I kept telling her, in the voice I used when I was deflecting, that I would think about it later. That was where part 1 ended, more or less. I had a fox beast girl who watched me when she thought I was not looking, and whose ears went flat whenever I spent more than I should have. I had 2 children running food stalls in a city they had never seen until I brought them there. I had a former Marchioness organizing my correspondence with the same intensity she had once used to organize political alliances. I had 2 friends, Haruto and Mamoru, who were already drifting toward independent lives, because that is what people do when they no longer need each other for survival. I sat on the dormitory's rooftop one night and watched the city glow. I thought about how strange it was that I had built any of this. I thought about Estura's warning, which I had not stopped ignoring. I thought about the fact that I had once been told by a king that I was unnecessary, and that nothing I had done in the months since had managed to convince me he was wrong. I let myself pretend for a little while that the warmth would last. It did not, but that is the next part. 5 days had passed since the rooftop. The shop was open. The salon had a 2-week waitlist. Mystia's family debt to the Margrave's house had been cleared by a single rejuvenation fruit she'd brought home one evening, and Mystia had tried to refuse the surplus money on top of the debt clearance because she did not, in her words, take charity. Operations were running. So was I, eventually. Timit found me at the dormitory in the middle of an idle morning. He was breathing hard. Behind him stood 4 beastmen, bear, wolf, rabbit, aardvark, leaning against each other in the way people lean when they have run out of standing by themselves. Timit had a story to tell, and it came out in pieces. The 4 had been jumped by an adventuring party that did not think beastmen counted as people. They had crawled to a guild healer. The guild healer had charged 20 gold as a dispatch fee and refused to lay hands on them. They had crawled to a church healer. Same answer, different number. "Where is Sina?" Sharon asked. Timot's face crumpled. She punched the party leader. Where is Sina? In the guild's holding cell. I healed the 4 beastmen in the foyer. It took less mana than warming a kettle. They woke up. They started thanking me with the particular intensity of people who had not expected to wake up at all. The bear was the first to stand. He was still apologizing for being a problem. He was still apologizing when Sharon got her coat. The guildmaster came out personally when he saw me. He apologized at length. He suggested a private room. He did not at any point attempt to explain why his healers had refused to treat the people lying in the alley behind his building. Scheherazade explained, in the diplomat's voice she used when I had told her not to murder anyone, the standard penalty for an adventurer who had assaulted another adventurer. Guild card revocation, a 10 gold fine, 10 gold compensation per injured party. The receptionist intervened. An unfortunate misunderstanding, she said. A mere fine should suffice. Sharon's ears went flat in the way they go flat when she has stopped speaking on my behalf because she is no longer interested in being polite. The guildmaster heard her silence and corrected himself. The standard penalty would be applied. Sina would be released. The party that had attacked the beastmen would be charged. He kept saying my name like he could prevent the conversation from continuing if he said it correctly enough. I placed the week's holy water on the registration desk. I told him the standard penalty would be paid in full because that was what the standard penalty was. I left. Sina was outside in the alley with the bear beastman, who was apologizing to her for a fight she had won by herself. She was 9 years old. She told him it was fine. She had a faint bruise on her cheek and the particular expression of a child who had already decided she would do it again if it came to it. I went to the Commerce Guild because I had run out of patience with the Adventurer Guild, and because Kimberly was the only person in the Imperial bureaucracy who responded to anger by asking what I needed. I told her I wanted to buy land. She asked how much. I told her enough for a treatment facility and an orphanage that would accept anyone, regardless of race, for a single copper coin. She closed the ledger she had been working on. She looked at me for a long moment. She asked if I was sure. She asked what would happen to the Imperial Healers Guild when their fee structure was undercut by a copper coin in the same district. I told her I had not asked for their input. She told me, with the particular patience of someone who had watched me make bad decisions before and would watch me make them again, that the Imperial Healers Guild had not asked for mine either. Then she stood up and put on her coat. She walked me to the palace. Coney was not the kind of emperor who held formal audiences. He was the kind of emperor who, when his commerce guild master brought a foreign healer in unannounced and presented a request for permission to open a treatment facility in his capital, complained about his back for the first 30 seconds and then said yes. I told him my conditions. The facility would treat anyone, regardless of race. The fee would be 1 copper coin. Those who could not pay would work it off in cleaning or childcare. He went silent at 1 copper coin. The civil official next to him went silent. Kimberly, who I had previously believed could not be surprised by anything, went silent. Then Coney asked me, in the voice of a man who had just realized he was about to lose an argument he had not realized was happening, why I was willing to do so much for his country. I told him it was not for his country. It was a tantrum. He understood that completely. The deal closed in 15 minutes. The civil official was making careful notes on a wax tablet. Kimberly was not making notes. She had given up on making notes around me weeks ago. 2 days later, the facility opened. Otherworld Shop's concierge system, at maximum level, had built the building from a raw lot in a single morning. 4 floors above ground, 2 below, 4 elevators, a treatment hall that could hold a small village, an orphanage wing that could take in 50 children if pressed. Scheherazade and Ashurashika each loaned me 10 of their subordinates as staff. I gave each subordinate a name, a uniform, and a skill book containing holy magic. The Bear Beastman party had spread the word in the slums for me as their preferred form of payment. By the time the doors opened, the line stretched around the block and around the block again. I performed mass healing in the underground gymnasium. Saints healing layered with Saints love, layered with Saints brilliance. I had stopped tracking which combinations did what years ago. The hall went bright, then the hall went quiet. Then the line outside grew, because the people inside had told the people outside what had happened. The barrier I had set on the front gate had 3 conditions. No one who would harm me or those close to me. No supremacist of any race. No one who used power arbitrarily. Coney showed up at the gate in disguise an hour after we opened and could not enter. His civil official, who had taken the careful notes on his wax tablet, walked through the gate unobstructed. I made a mental note. I went back inside. 2 weeks later, the facility was running on its own. The salon had cake sets and a drink bar bar now, run by Scheherazada's children, who had apparently learned baking during their 2.5 years inside Mamoru's miniature garden. The clinic was so well attended that Adventurer Guild members had started using it when their own healers were unavailable. Istora was managing all of it, so when Coney asked if I would come look at the wasteland he had given me, and could he come along, I said fine, because the alternative was sitting at home thinking about whether the church would respond this week or next. The bus was the cleanest solution. I had bought it from the Otherworld shop the morning of the trip. It was a long modern coach with reclining seats, a kitchen, and air conditioning. The fortress of the Saints' sanctuary barrier wrapped the whole vehicle so we could not be ambushed, and the ride could not be jostled. Coney's knights drove the road for us with earth magic, smoothing the dirt as we went. 2 days got us there. Coney spent the whole trip eating snacks he had never seen before and asking what each one was. Sharon's ears were not flat exactly, but they were not relaxed either. Timit and Sina had come along because they had asked, and because I had already learned not to leave them places they wanted to go. The land had been cursed for 2 generations. Monsters at level 100 to 120. The mana density was past the threshold where a region became a dungeon by accident, just from neglect. The Eternal Knights cleared the basin in under an hour, while Coney took his retainers leveling at the perimeter. He had been overdue for combat practice, and we both knew it. I generated holy water as a fine mist and let the barrier hold it inside the basin. The mist rose and turned to light rain. The rain fell. The rain stopped. The miasma was gone. Scheherazade said something complimentary about my form. Ashereshika said something corrective about my form. They had recently started bickering with each other in ways I found endearing and Sharon found exhausting. By the next morning, the Otherworld shop's town package had laid down rice paddies, vegetable fields, asphalt roads, sidewalks, apartment blocks, a cafe, a small convenience store, and a bus stop. Scheherazade left 250 subordinates to maintain the farms. Ashereshika left 250 to run the buildings. Coney came back from leveling, looked at the town that had not existed when he left, and asked me what kind of place this was. I told him it was an experiment. I had started farming, I told him, because I thought I might be able to feed the orphanage. He looked at me for a long time. He asked if he could buy some of the produce. I told him he could, as long as we did not become enemies. He laughed. Then he stopped laughing. We came back through the Saintess Wish door. Ashereshika opened the gate to a road on the capital's outskirts, rather than directly into the city. The Imperial Palace would have noticed if Coney materialized in his own throne room without warning, and we did not want the kind of meeting that explanation would generate. We walked the rest of the way to the inn. I was tired in the specific way you get tired after a successful day, when your body has not done very much, but your brain has been running diagnostics the whole time. Mistia was waiting for us at the inn. She had been waiting for an hour. She had a list. The salon was so popular, it had emptied its reserve nail polish and was running short on 3 other essentials. And could I please send Sharon over with stock as soon as possible? If I had any subordinates who could be spared as additional staff, she would be deeply grateful. She apologized constantly while she was talking. She also did not stop talking. Sharon took the list and told her not to worry about it. Estora was inside, pretending to be reading a book in the lobby and actually waiting for me. She gave me her management report, daily salon takings, holy water deliveries on schedule, the clinic's case files for the week, an inventory of the dormitory's pantry. Then she set the report down and leaned forward an inch. "The church has been asking questions about you at the Commerce Guild," she said. "Nothing official, yet, but they are measuring." I told her I would think about it later. She did not respond to that. She did not need to. I went up to the rooftop. I watched the city glow. I told myself I would think about it tomorrow. I had been very good at lying to myself recently, and I was getting better. I should not have been. Haruto and Mamoru were gone when I woke up. There was a note on the kitchen table in Haruto's handwriting that said roughly, "Going on a trip, won't be back for a while. Take care of yourself. The inn won't notice if you stop reserving our rooms." Mamoru had attached his own note to the bottom. "Eastern Continent for Haruto. Foreign Archives for me. Bring back something useful, or just bring back. Either way." The signatures were both punctuation marks. Haruto used an exclamation point. Mamoru used a comma. Shirone made breakfast. I ate breakfast. Estora arrived at her usual time and pretended she had not noticed the note on the table, which was the kindest thing she had ever done for me. The dormitory had become extremely quiet, in the specific way places become quiet when they have lost people who weren't loud. I told myself I would move into the house Coney had given me. Sharon informed me, with the particular tone she used when she had been waiting to tell me something for a few days, that the house had become a tourist attraction. The garden's glass house was photogenic. The two elf-blooded servants, Une and Uo, who had been assigned to the property by the Eternal Knights, were apparently serving tea to noble visitors who had begun arriving in carriages. I stayed at the inn. I paid for another month. I also ordered Mystia's salon supplies from the Otherworld shop in 15 minutes flat, because logistics was an excellent way to not feel things, and I was getting better at not feeling things. That afternoon, the salon needed 2 new male staff. Ashur Shika summoned them from her subordinate pool and gave them to me. One in his 40s with the bearing of a butler, one a teenager with the face of someone who would cause a stampede if shown to noblewomen. I sent them to the salon. Mystia returned to the inn an hour later with the expression of someone who had survived a small natural disaster and learned to thrive in it. 3 days later, the children dragged me to the orphanage early in the morning. The orphanage was holding a sea bug buying event. The line stretched down the street and around 2 corners. 289 people, slum residents, beastfolk, families with children, several adventurers who had heard there was money in shrimp now and wanted to verify the rumor. Ashureshika handled the counting. Sharona handled the payments. The orphans handed out tea to the people in line, partly because they were eager to help and partly because Astora had instructed them, with no room for negotiation, that no one waiting at her facility would stand in the sun without water. I cooked. I had not cooked in public in months, and the Bear Beastman party had brought their dismantling knives. So once the sea bugs were processed, I started on a barbecue. Shrimp mayonnaise, boiled crab with vinegar. The first batch was eaten by orphans. The second batch was eaten by the line. The third batch was eaten by the Bear Beastman party, who had been watching for an hour and trying to pretend they were not interested in dinner. The bear apologized for being a problem twice before accepting his plate. The wolf accepted his plate without speaking and ate it without speaking and asked for a second one without speaking. The rabbit watched everyone else eat first and then ate carefully, in small bites, like a person who had not been certain there would be enough food in his life again. The Aardvark Beastman ate his crab with vinegar and refused to comment on the taste. He told me, instead, that I had opened a charity healing center attached to an orphanage with better treatment than minor nobles received, and that he was not sure whether that made me a saint or someone playing at being a noble. I told him it could be both. He ate another crab. He looked briefly at the bear, who was on his 4th shrimp. Then he ate another crab. By evening, I had set up a monthly buying day. I had hired the Bear Beastman party as escort guards for those events. I had arranged dismantling work at 1 silver coin per person per day for anyone with the skills. The penalty for theft, I told them, was that I would chase the thief to the ends of the earth and feed them to a sea dragon. The Wolf Beastman asked if I was joking. I told him I was not. He stopped chewing for a moment, then resumed more slowly. 2 weeks later, I held the tea party Scheherazade had told me I owed the nobles. It was not a tea party. I had been informed with great patience that nobles in the empire expected this kind of social obligation as part of being a person who existed in the empire, and that refusing it indefinitely would generate a different kind of trouble than the kind I was already attracting. So I gave them what I had been doing in my head for 2 weeks instead of thinking about my friends being gone. A carnival, food stalls, shooting galleries, goldfish scooping, card magic, massage chairs from the Otherworld shop, 20 of them, set up in a row beneath a striped awning. Scheherazade handled the kitchen. Ashureshika handled the games. Estura handled the nobles, who arrived by carriage in formal dress and stayed long after they had originally intended to leave. Coney attended in disguise, which fooled exactly nobody, but everyone played along anyway. His wife, the Empress of the Northern Continent, whom I had never been formally introduced to because Coney had never bothered to introduce us, won the goldfish scooping high score and refused to give back the tray. She told me, with the tone of a woman who had been married for a long time, that if her husband insisted on being a casual man at carnivals, she had every right to be a casual woman with goldfish. I made a mental note that I liked her. Ziolo arrived with his son Mikero. He had been a successful continental merchant for half a year and had built a sea bug trade empire that spanned 3 countries because I had once recognized shrimp on a beach. He recognized me, embraced me, told me he had heard about my recent shop and clinic and orphanage, and could not stop talking about how I had not changed. Then someone called Coney Your Majesty, within his hearing, by accident, and Zeola went pale, then green, then very still. I told him that Coney had been with us in disguise since before I knew what country I was in. Zeolo nodded slowly. He stopped trying to bow. He did not stop trembling exactly, but he stopped showing it. Mikuro went off with Timut and Sienna to play at the food stalls. They came back later with 3 goldfish in a small bowl. Mikuro had won the goldfish. Then Sharon took the stage. She had told me 3 days earlier, in passing, that she could sing. She had not told me what she meant. Sharon stepped onto the stage in a dress Scheherazade had commissioned for her, pale silver blue with a layered hem, embroidered with subtle white fox motifs along the bodice that you only saw if you were looking. Her hair was pinned up. Her ears were not flat. She held the microphone like it was an old friend she had not held in too long. She sang. I do not have the words. I had not known voices could do that. I was not ready. The carnival went quiet in sections, like silence spreading from a dropped stone. People in the adjacent streets stopped walking. A fishmonger 4 blocks away later told me he had heard it from his shop and could not move until she stopped. The Empress had to sit down. Coney, who had been eating grilled corn, also had to sit down. Estora did not sit down, but she put her hand on the back of a chair and did not move it for the duration. She sang for about 11 minutes. She sang in a language only she and I and Haruto and Mamoru could understand, but it did not matter because anyone who was listening understood the shape of what was happening, even if they did not understand the words. She had been a star actress in a traveling theater troupe before her enslavement. Her troupe had been lured to the Holy Kingdom and murdered. She had not sung in public since. She was singing now. When she stopped, nobody moved for several seconds. Then someone clapped. Then someone else. Then the entire courtyard. Sharon bowed once, came down off the stage, walked over to where I was standing, looked up at me, and asked if I had liked it. I told her yes. She said, good, and walked into the kitchen to see how the food was doing. I stood there for another minute. Then I went and flipped a tray of shrimp because I did not know what else to do with my hands. The carnival lasted 3 days. Nobles attended. Souvenirs were distributed. Small flasks of universal wound potion, 1 capful each, packaged with the carnival's commemorative label. I learned 6 weeks later, by accident, that those flasks were already trading on the black market for 10 times the carnival's entry tickets. I let that one go. There were limits to how much of the Empire's economy I could babysit at one time. In the days that followed, the routine resumed. Holy water deliveries, salon takings, clinic patient logs, Sharon's ledgers, which were now organized into 3 categories Estora had imposed on her without asking. Timut and Sina ran their food stalls in the central market. Coney sent a polite note that he had not stopped thinking about the carnival, and would I please host another one in the spring? I did not respond to that note. The Adventurer Guild's quest board began posting jobs that asked specifically for the healer with the voice that was at the carnival, which I assumed was a clerical mistake until Scheherazade clarified that no, the customers were specifically asking for Sharoni now. Toward the end of the next week, the Adventurer Guild summoned me to resolve a complaint from the previous visit. A drunk had harassed me during last week's holy water delivery. Scheherazade had handled the situation by breaking 3 bottles of holy water on the floor and announcing to the entire guild hall that I was rank SSS, the highest the system had ever issued. The guildmaster wanted the incident formally documented for the records. The church's standing inquiry on my license to practice healing had also produced a formal request for clarification about the rank announcement, which had spread further than Scheherazade had intended. I told the guildmaster I would come in next week to handle the paperwork. He looked relieved. That was the last time I walked into that building without anyone waiting for me. I did not know that then. I know it now. I had a week left. I would spend it the way I spent every week. I would deliver holy water. I would heal people the city had decided did not count. I would eat dinner with Sharon and the children. I would go up to the rooftop at night and watch the city glow and tell myself I had time. I did not have time. But that is the next phase. A week passed. I delivered holy water to the castle on Tuesday. The civil official, who had become quietly fond of me since the carnival, accepted 5 bottles for 5 gold coins and slipped me a small cloth-wrapped box of imperial pastries he had bought for himself and decided I should have instead. I delivered to the Commerce Guild on Wednesday. Kimberly took 5 bottles, paid 5 gold, and apologized for the second time that morning for letting the Imperial Healers Guild take a position on my facility that she had not been able to walk back. I told her I had not asked her to walk it back. She nodded once, the way she did when she had heard me but had not believed me. The Pharmacist Guild took 15 bottles in addition to a stock of recovery herbs from the underwater dungeons. The Pharmacist Guild was always grateful and always broke. I let them pay what they had. On Thursday, I went to the Adventurer Guild for the paperwork. The guildmaster came out personally. He apologized at length, again, for last week's drunk. He had a stack of forms. He wanted the incident formally documented for the records, which adventurer had started it, which staff had intervened, what exactly Scheherazade had done with the bag of holy water. The forms were the kind of paperwork that nobody enjoys filling out and everybody insists on. I sat at the registration desk. Scheherazade stood behind me. Sharon stood to my left with a pen in case any of the forms required her signature, which several of them did because the Commerce Guild had cross-listed me as an external supplier. The hall was busy in the specific way Adventurer Guild halls are busy. Adventurers shouting requests, clerks ignoring them, a quest board nobody was reading. I had been signing my name in the third box on the second to last page when the door at the far end of the hall opened. Scheherazade said my name. She did not say it loudly. She said it in the tone she used when something was wrong. I looked up. 4 men in formal robes, ivory cassocks with crimson sashes, heavy ornate crosses on chains at the chest. The Holy Kingdom's gold thread emblem worked into the embroidery. Behind the 4 men, 2 Imperial enforcement officers in dark gray uniforms, not Coney's guard, the other the kind that handled paperwork that nobody wanted to put their name on. The hall began to go quiet in sections, like silence spreading from a dropped stone. I set the pen down. The lead priest walked the length of the hall slowly. He was about 50, salt and pepper hair, sharp, narrow blue eyes, the kind of face that had practiced its expression in a mirror until the expression was the face. He held a sealed scroll in one gloved hand. The 3 priests behind him stayed 3 paces back. The Imperial enforcement officers stayed at the door, blocking it. He stopped about 10 feet from me. He read from the scroll in a loud, clear voice designed to fill the hall. Unauthorized production of holy water, a substance designated as divine property of the Church of the Holy Kingdom, operating as a healer without church certification, providing services to non-human races in violation of Holy Kingdom treaty provisions, inciting unrest by undermining the church's lawful pricing structure, charges, in summary, unauthorized divine service, and treason against the Holy Kingdom. He did not raise his voice for the word treason. He delivered it the same way he had delivered everything else, which was the version that carried the weight. I noted, internally, that they had got my class title wrong on the document. It said Saint. It should have said High School Boy. I considered correcting them. I did not. Scheherazade had already moved. She was now standing 1/2 step ahead of me. She was, in Scheherazade terms, vibrating. Her hands were not in fists yet, but they were in the position before fists. Last week, she had broken 5 bottles of holy water on a man's chin. This week, she had several thousand bottles in storage, an open courtyard on the far side of the door, and a particular grudge against organized hypocrisy. I could see very clearly the next 10 seconds if I did not move. I put my hand on her sleeve. She looked at me. I shook my head once. She did not relax. She did stop vibrating. I stood up from the registration desk. I told the guildmaster, who was standing 2 paces behind me with his face the color of old cheese, that I would handle this through the proper channels. I told the lead priest the standard penalty for an SSS rank healer accused of treason was, presumably, also detention pending evidence, and I would come quietly because that was what coming quietly looked like. I did not say that fighting them in the Adventurer Guild's main hall would give the church exactly the legitimate grievance their entire case currently lacked. The lead priest's expression did not change. I did not expect it to. Sharoni met my eyes. She had understood the calculation by the second sentence of the document. Her ears were flat in a way that did not move. She did not say anything. I did not say anything to her. I looked at her for one breath, long enough to communicate everything I needed to communicate. And then I looked away first because I was not strong enough to keep looking. 2 of the priests stepped forward to bind my hands. I let them. Scheherazade made a small sound that was not quite a word. The cuffs were ceremonial, not functional. They would not have held me for more than a second if I had decided otherwise. They knew that. I knew it. The hall knew it. I walked out of the Adventurer Guild between 4 priests, ahead of 2 Imperial enforcers, in front of 300 witnesses who were now formally on the record as having seen an SSS rank healer arrested for selling clean water to people who could not otherwise afford it. I did not look back at the hall as I left. That was a calculation too. The walk to the church's holding facility took about 20 minutes. The lead priest set a moderate pace, fast enough to look like authority, slow enough to be seen by the crowds we passed. He was performing for the city. He wanted the noble district to watch this. The noble district watched. People at cafe windows set down their cups and did not pick them up again. A noblewoman in a passing carriage saw me, recognized me, and put her hand over her mouth. A child pointed. The child's mother pulled the child's arm down. A merchant I had bought spices from twice came out into the street, took 2 steps toward us, looked at the priest, looked at my expression, and stopped. He went back inside. He did not look at me again. I noted the names of the streets we walked down. I noted which of the noble houses had drawn their curtains and which had not. I noted that one of the imperial enforcement officers behind me had been at the carnival 3 weeks ago, eating grilled corn, and was now refusing to make eye contact with me because he had liked the corn and had, perhaps, also liked Sharon's singing, and was now walking me to a church dungeon for selling clean water. I did not blame him. I noted it. The church's holding facility was at the far end of the noble district, a long, low stone building set against the inside of the city wall. Old infrastructure. The Holy Kingdom had used it for decades under their treaty rights with the Empire. The doors were thick oak banded with iron. The hinges were quiet. Someone had oiled them recently. We went through the entrance, down a stone corridor, past a guard station where 2 more priests were waiting and did not look up. Down a flight of stairs, down another. The temperature dropped. The walls became damper. The air began to smell like old water and stone that had not seen sun. Down another flight, to a corridor of cells, iron bars, flickering torches set into wall sconces. The cells were not empty. I noted in the corner of my vision, faces in the shadows behind the bars on either side of me. I did not turn my head. The lead priest gestured to a cell at the end of the corridor. The door was open. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me. The mechanism made a single dull sound that was both small and final. The lock was the kind that turned with a heavy iron key, and the key turned and was withdrawn. Footsteps moved away down the corridor. The torch nearest my cell guttered, then settled. I stood in the middle of the stone floor for a moment. Then it was dark. I should mention that Scheherazade had walked into the dungeon with me. The priests had not actually realized she was a separate entity. They had assumed she was a servant accompanying me, which was technically accurate except for everything that mattered about it. She had walked in because I had not told her not to. She was now standing in the cell beside me, surveying the floor, and she was about to do something I would not have done myself, but was about to be glad of. The cell was about the size of a small bedroom in my old apartment. There was a stone floor that was not clean. There was a wooden cot with a single thin blanket. There was a stone toilet pot in the corner that had not been emptied in long enough that it was no longer a toilet pot, exactly, but more of a small ecosystem with strong opinions about its right to remain. Scheherazade made a sound that I had previously associated only with discovering a stain on a guest's clothes. She incinerated the toilet pot with a precise application of fire magic that did not touch any other surface in the cell. I cast clean. The smell vanished. So did the maggots. So did the years of accumulated whatever that had been on the floor before the maggots had got there. The cell now smelled like nothing, which was already a remarkable improvement. Then Scheherazade opened her item box and started building. A carpet, layered, woven, the kind I had previously only seen in noble salons. A bed, actual bed, with a frame and a real mattress, not the cot. A small writing desk and a chair, a tea table, a standing lamp, a folding screen for privacy around the new toilet, which she replaced from the Otherworld shop in approximately 15 seconds. A small refrigerator, a heater, a tea service. A church guard came down the corridor about an hour later, carrying a tin tray with 2 slices of black bread and a clay mug of muddy water. He stopped at our cell. He looked through the bars. He looked at the carpet. He looked at the lamp. He looked at Scheherazade, who was at the moment pouring herself tea from a porcelain pot. He said something in the kind of voice you use when reality has stopped accepting your input. Scheherazade told him, in a tone of polite contempt, that I would later try and fail to imitate, that we had brought our own dinner. She suggested he take the bread back and feed it to himself. The guard left. He did not return that evening. I sat down on the proper bed. I opened my smartphone. I had a series of messages waiting. Ashurshika had reached the dormitory. Sharon had been informed. Estura had begun documentation. Coney had been formally notified. Spilgalg, the imperial bureaucrat I had given recovery potions to once, had requested copies of every receipt the holy water contracts had generated since their inception. I sent one message back to Sharon. It said, "I'm fine, don't come." She did not respond, but her reply came through 20 minutes later as an attached document. The next week's holy water delivery schedule, fully revised, with a note that she would be handling deliveries personally. She had not asked for permission. She did not need to. I put the smartphone down. I picked up a manga from the small reading shelf Scheherazade had unpacked. I started reading. I learned the shape of the dungeon over the next 2 days. There were 9 other cells on our floor. Scheherazade extended her sacred barrier out from our cell, threading it through the corridor's stonework until it touched each adjacent cell. A trick I had seen her perform once before, on a long sea voyage, when one of the cabin's neighbors had caught a fever and we had needed to project Saint's healing through a wall. Through the barrier, she could pass items into cells she could not physically enter. Through the barrier, I could heal whoever was in those cells without the priest knowing. The first cell she investigated was held by a beastman healer who had been taken from a temple in the slum district 6 months ago for treating beastfolk during a plague outbreak. He had been there ever since. He had been beaten regularly. His left hand was crooked from breaks that had set badly. I healed it through the barrier. He cried for a long time and then ate the meal Scheherazade pushed through. The second cell held a woman who had undersold candles below the church's tithe rates. She had been there 4 months. The third was a merchant accused of trading with beastfolk customers. He had been there 9 months. The fourth had a girl who could not have been more than 15, who had been there for 2 months for refusing to denounce a neighbor. The fifth was empty in the way some things were empty when they had stopped being someone. So was the seventh. So was the eighth. I did the math. 3 of the 9 other cells held bodies. The bodies had been there for varying lengths of time. None of them were old enough that Saint's mercy would not work. I did not perform the rite yet. I was going to wait. Scheherazade fed every living person on the floor that morning. She did it by hand, through the barrier, and she did it without making any of them feel they were eating charity. By the second day, they had a heater each, a carpet, a bed they could sleep on, clean water, a change of clothes. The dignity that the church had spent months trying to grind out of them returned in the very space the grinding had occurred. The church guards arrived twice on the second day to investigate. They were unable to enter our cell because of the barrier. They were also unable to enter several of the other cells because Scheherazade had extended her courtesy. They reported to the priests. The priests came down. The priests had a conversation with Scheherazade through the bars that I will not repeat because I do not record private conversations between 2 ladies on the topic of social rank. The priests stopped coming down to the floor after that. So did the guards. The empire fell apart slowly while I read manga. I should be careful with that sentence. The empire did not fall apart. Not really. The empire was administered by people who had been administering it for years, and most of them showed up to work the same way they had the week before. But the parts of the empire I had been involved with, the salon, the clinic, the orphanage, the holy water deliveries to the 4 major guilds, those parts shut down within 10 days because they had been running on me and I was no longer there to run them. I learned about it through smartphone messages. Scheherazade had a calm version of events. Sharon had a precise version of events. Astora had a frankly terrifying version of events. The salon ran out of nail polish on day 4. The Otherworld shop's pharmacist was, per Sharone, geographically inconvenient, since I was the only person who had the supplier interface unlocked. The clinic continued running for 9 days because Astora had pre-positioned 3 weeks of supplies, but the patients who showed up after that were turned away, and there were hundreds of them per day. The Adventurer Guild's holy water allocation depleted in the first week. The Commerce Guilds by the end of the second. The Pharmacist Guild had given up after the third. Timit and Sina had stopped supplying the Adventurer Guild with monster meat. They had stopped, the message said. On Ashereshika's instruction, they would resume, they were telling everyone, when their older brother returned. Their stalls in the central market had become the most popular eating spots in the imperial capital. They were not making more money than usual. They were making less because they had been instructed to charge slum prices and feed beastfolk customers free if they could not pay. The line for their stalls extended around 2 corners by the 3rd week. Astora had begun what Sharon called the campaign. She was provoking church guards in the noble district, standing too close to their patrols, asking pointed questions about the location of Holy Kingdom citizens detained on imperial soil, letting her attendant, who I would later learn was Mystia, be jostled by a church soldier in a way that resulted in 3 witnesses, 1 bruise, and a formally lodged complaint with the Imperial Enforcement Bureau. Then doing it again, with different attendants, in different districts, on different days. She was building a case. She did not want me to know how thoroughly she was building it. Coney, per Scheherazade, was disappointing. The phrase used in her message was, "I am disappointed in Emperor Koenig." It was the most affectionate thing she had ever said about him. She did not elaborate. Haruto and Mamoru were laughing at us. Their version of events arrived in messages from the eastern continent that had clearly been forwarded from Shirone. Haruto's contribution was, roughly, more. Keep it up. Are the girls going to take over the central continent and sage the northern one? Mamoru's was a single line. Try not to break anything you can't replace. I was not entirely sure which of us he was talking to. I read 17 long manga series. I finished the police procedural, the pirate one, the hard-boiled sniper, the Bloodline saga that ran 60 volumes, the spiritual energy battle one, and the detective story. I started another one and did not finish it. I had been imprisoned for 32 days when Spilgalg arrived. The cell door opened from the outside. Spilgalg looked exactly the way he had looked in the Imperial Court 3 months earlier, which is to say, he had dark circles under his eyes that were now suggesting they wanted citizenship of their own, and he was holding the same kind of leather document case he had been holding then. He apologized for taking 32 days. He explained briefly that the Imperial inquiry had required documented evidence of church misconduct against Imperial citizens before the Empire could legally raid a Holy Kingdom diplomatic facility, and that Estora's documentation campaign, he used her name in a tone of professional respect, had reached the threshold 3 days earlier. The Imperial Knights had entered the facility at dawn. Most of the church staff had fled overnight. The lead priest who had read me the document was already in Imperial custody. Spilgalg apologized for taking 32 days. He apologized again. He told me simply that he was relieved I looked well, and that I had apparently also looked after the other prisoners on the floor, for which he was grateful. Scheherazade led him from cell to cell, opening them with the keys the Imperial Knights had taken off the church guards. We came to the cells with the bodies. Scheherazade opened them without ceremony. The knights stopped at the doors. Spilgalg stopped at the doors. I went in. There were 3, a man, an older woman, a boy, maybe 17. I did not ask what had been done to them. I did not need to. The cells told me. The bodies told me. Spilgalg's face told me, in the way he was now refusing to look at any of them directly because looking made the 32 days into something he had let happen by being slow. I performed Saint's Mercy 3 times. The skill is not a resurrection. It is a release. It frees a soul that has been held in this world by the violence of its leaving. The first man's soul went easily. It had been waiting to be allowed. The older woman's took longer. The boy's was hardest. I do not have the words for what hard means in that context. The narration does not know what to do with that moment, so the narration is going to skip it. When I finished, Scheherazade was standing 1/2 step behind me. Spilgalg had taken off his hat. The knights had bowed their heads. I did not say anything. I walked out of the cells. I walked down the corridor. I walked up the stairs. The light at the top was very bright. The street outside was full. Not a parade, not a cheering crowd, just full. Beastfolk who had been treated at the clinic. The Bear Beastman party in the front, standing the way bodyguards stand when they are not being paid to and have decided they are doing it anyway. Timit and Sienna, who had closed their stalls for the day. Estura to the side, with the particular expression of a woman who had just won an argument she had been preparing for 40 days. Sharon, in the middle of the street, ledger under her arm, ears not flat for the first time since the morning the priests had come. Zeolo was there too. He had ridden in from the central continent. He had heard he was telling anyone who would listen, 2 days into my imprisonment, and had sent a continental notice through the merchant networks that any caravan transporting church goods through his territories would not be receiving his protection services. He had said this casually, in passing, the way you mentioned the weather. The ramifications had been significant, and at the back, leaning against a lamppost with no security and no ceremony, in the same disguise he had been wearing the day of the carnival, Coney, without crown, without bodyguard, standing in the street the way he always stood, like a man who had wandered into an important moment by accident. Nobody was performing. The crowd was not cheering. They were just there. I stopped on the second to last step. I looked at them. I looked at Shirone. She looked at me. She did not say anything. I did not say anything to her. We did the thing we had been doing for over a year, communicating without using language, because language was insufficient, and also because both of us had a limited tolerance for sincerity in public. I walked down the last step. I told Shirone I had not died. She told me she knew. I asked if dinner was ready. She said it had been ready since this morning in the kitchen of the dormitory, and that we should walk slowly because Estora was holding the food food back until I arrived, because Astora did not, on principle, allow anyone to begin eating without me. I walked. The crowd parted. We went home. 2 days after the release, 2 parcels arrived at the inn. They had been brought separately by separate couriers from the merchant network. Both had paid for express delivery from the eastern continent. The first was a wooden crate marked with Haruto's Adventuring Guild seal. The second was a smaller cloth-wrapped bundle marked with a sigil Mamoru had been using since college, which I had never asked him about because I had assumed there was a reason he had not explained it. I opened Haruto's first. Inside the crate was what looked like a polished metallic box about the size of my forearm. There was a folded note. The note said, in Haruto's loose handwriting, that the box's name was Huey, that he was a movement-specialized far-distant knight, that the stat allocation favored strength and stamina and agility, so I could use him in place of a horse if needed. The note added in a smaller line at the bottom, heard about the church thing, figured you could use backup. I touched the box with my mana. The box unfolded in a series of motions that I was not equipped to describe in 3 dimensions, into a small quadruped robot the height of a child. It bowed at me. It informed me, in a voice that was somehow both polite and amused, that it could expand to adult human size on request. I asked it to. It did. It bowed again. I asked it to go small. It did. I had a new horse-sized pet that could become a person and back. I sat with that for a moment. I opened Mamoru's bundle. Inside Mamoru's bundle was a small fairy. He was about the size of a cat, jet black, with the sort of poised silhouette that you got in the shadow at the end of a hallway when nobody was supposed to be in the hallway. He handed me a card. The card said his name was Pixie Joe, that he was a scout-class far-distant knight specialized in reconnaissance and assassination, and that he could not change size because he had spent the customization budget on capability instead. He apologized in a tone that made it clear he was not actually apologizing for the inconvenience of his fixed size. Mamoru's note said, since Haruto did this, I did the same. The fairy's information radius exceeds standard guild scouts by a factor of 12. Try not to break anything you can't replace. I read both notes twice. I introduced Huey to Scheherazade, who took one look at him and immediately produced a small robe from her item box and put it on him. I asked Pixie Joe to scout the city's grain supply situation as a first task. He saluted with 2 fingers and was not in the room 12 seconds later. I sat down on the bed and did not say what I was feeling about either of these gifts, because I did not have to. Sharon was watching me. She also did not say anything. She took the second note out of my hand, read it, folded it, and put it in the desk's top drawer where she kept the things I had asked her to keep. The dormitory was very quiet for the rest of the evening. Coney sent a polite messenger the next morning. He had heard I had received gifts. He had decided he was also entitled to one. I exchanged a far-distant knight with him in the most reluctant transaction of my recent life, and ended up the day with 3 new types in my household, of which I was actively grateful for 2. The Empire's food crisis had been building since before my imprisonment. I had been told this in passing for weeks. The Chaos Dragon's miasma was killing farmland in the central continent. Refugees were flooding the imperial borders, and the central continent's civil war, which I would later learn was statistically related to several of my former classmates, had cut the Empire's adventurer supply by roughly 1 in 7. The Adventurer Guild had been understaffed before the imprisonment. After 32 days of no monster meat from Timit and Sina, the situation had become an emergency. Kimberly had asked. The Adventurer Guild's master had asked. Even Spilgog had asked, indirectly, by letting me see his face. I took the contracts. The next 10 days were a montage. Several villages, several monster hunts, several barriers raised over rural farmsteads to keep things from eating them in the night. Scheherazade and Ashereshika handled most of the actual combat. At this point in my career, I had stopped pretending I was a combat presence and had become content with my role as the source of holy water and barriers and the occasional bowl of soup. I hired the Bear Beastman party as guides. The Wolf Beastman finally smiled at one of my jokes by the 3rd village. The Aardvark continued to refuse to confirm whether I was a saint or someone playing at being a noble. The Rabbit ate 4 bowls of stew the night we cleared a goblin-occupied watermill and slept on the inn's hearth like a man who had not been warm in his life until then. The emergency stop was the orc settlement. 6,000 orcs had organized a forward camp on a basin near a potato village. The village had 240 residents. The orcs had been sending raiding parties for 3 weeks. A single direct assault on the village would have ended it. We arrived at midday. Huey scouted with his radar and identified the camp's perimeter. Pixie Joe scouted the interior and reported troop dispositions. Scheherazade extended my barrier to encircle the entire camp. The Bear Beastman party, who had been told they would be participating, killed roughly 100 orcs each by their own count, which was the most they had ever fought in one engagement, and which they would tell their grandchildren about. Scheherazade and Ashareshika handled the rest with the efficiency of people who could no longer be surprised by anything they were asked to do. The whole engagement took 56 minutes. I purified the basin with holy water. I asked the village if they had ingredients for soup. The village chief sat down on the ground and cried. I made soup. We did this in 5 more villages over the next 8 days. The empire's food crisis became, in those 8 days, the empire's recovering food crisis. The Adventurer Guild filed paperwork. Kimberly cried again. I took my new fairy and my new horse pet and went home. The empire's birth festival was 9 days away. Coney's birthday festival was the most popular event on the imperial calendar. 7 days of free food, a city full of stalls, an opening parade, a closing party, and somewhere in the middle, the actual day on which Coney pretended to enjoy his own birthday. I had been formally invited. I had formally declined. I had sent a gift instead: 5 panacea potions, a liter of amrita, 10 rejuvenation fruits, 5 hair growth potions, and an adamantite tree from one of the seafloor dungeons, packed in a magic bag seed wrapped in deep-sea spider silk. Sharon had told me, with her ears at a particular angle, that the gift was probably worth a national budget. I had told her that was approximately the point. Coney came to the inn alone the day before the festival. He was alone. No bodyguards, no aide, no civil official. The maid who announced him was paler than the holy water bottle she had been about to deliver. She left very quickly. Coney sat in the second chair across from me and accepted a cup of tea and a small plate of imported chocolate with almonds, which I had been saving for a later occasion. But he was the emperor, and his birthday was in 7 days, and I had not done anything else thoughtful for him recently. He asked me, with the tone of a man who had decided to be direct because indirect had not worked, to attend his birthday party. I told him I would not. I told him I had been invited to too many parties recently and was running low on the specific kind of social energy that parties demanded. I told him the gift I had sent was the part of me he was getting for the festival. He sighed. He drank tea. He asked me, in a tone of quiet apology, if he had let me down during the imprisonment. I considered telling him the truth. I told him the truth instead. Yes, he had, but the situation had been more complicated than I had wanted to admit when it was happening, and I understood why he had waited. He nodded. He did not look relieved exactly. He looked the way a man looks when he has been told he is forgiven and is not certain he should accept it. He left half an hour later. He thanked me, separately, for the chocolate. He was still walking away when his aide caught up with him in the inn's courtyard, and I overheard, through the open window, the aide telling him that an elderly woman from the Western continent had been asking about me at the casino district for the 3rd day in a row. She had not given a name. She had described me with significant accuracy. She had asked specifically after my late father's son. I drank my tea. I did not have a late father. I would think about that, I told myself, after the festival. 2 days passed. The festival began. Coney's birthday was in 5 days. I had nothing to do, so I went to the casino. The imperial capital's high-end casino was built using treasure chest items from a high-difficulty dungeon called the Thief-Crying Dungeon, which Sharon explained on the way in with the particular tone she used when she was telling me a fact she suspected I would later try to make use of in a way she would have to manage. I told her I was not going to clear the dungeon. I told her I was going to lose a small amount of money, eat dinner, and go home. Sharon's ears were not flat exactly, but they were not relaxed. We were not turned away at the door despite my outfit, partly because Scheherazade and Ashareshika in formal maid attire constituted approximately 90% of the dress code, and partly because the doorman recognized my face from the carnival. Inside, the floor was loud in a particular way that I had been to enough of these establishments to recognize. People winning, people losing, people deciding whether they were winning or losing. A dealer at the far table was also, on closer inspection, having a complicated conversation with a noblewoman who was halfway through losing 1,000 gold coins on a single game and showed no signs of stopping. I knew her voice before I saw her face. She was begging the dealer for one more round in the universal tone of a person who had lost 1,000 gold coins because they had absolutely been about to win on the very next hand. The dealer was being patient. He had probably been patient for an hour. The casino's manager was now in the doorway behind the dealer, also being patient. In the slightly tighter way, managers are patient when their floor staff cannot escalate further. I walked over. She looked up. "Seichan, my grandmother said. She tried to hug me first and ask for money second. I noted the order with relief. I gave her the money. The casino's manager, who had been about to physically remove a foreign noblewoman from the premises and was now doing the diplomatic recalculation appropriate to her being someone's grandson's grandmother, walked us all very politely to a private room. Sharon followed. So did Scheherazade. So did the grandmother's 3 attendants, who had been standing along the wall trying to pretend they did not know her, and who now looked at her in the particular way attendants look at a charge they have been waiting to be allowed to talk about. The private room was velvet and quiet. We sat down. My grandmother spread the silk shawl that had been wrapped around her shoulders. She picked up the tea the manager had brought without being asked. She told me, with the tone of someone presenting a small social achievement, that she was friends with the emperor of the northern continent, which was why she was at the casino in the first place. She added, casually, that she had come to attend his birthday festival. She then asked if I would attend with her because she wanted to introduce me to people. I told her I would think about it. She nodded happily, sipped her tea, and added in the same tone that my father would be arriving in 3 days. I set my own tea down. I had a number of questions. She came back the next morning before I was awake. I learned later from Sharon that she had been sitting beside my bed for at least an hour because she had not wanted to wake me and because she had wanted, in her words, to look at me. The image of my grandmother sitting beside my bed in a foreign country in a different world was not something I had a frame for. I did not, on waking, have the resources to ask her what she had been thinking about. I made tea. She told me her story. She was, she explained, the queen of one of 3 great kingdoms on the western continent, the one with the forest. She had been queen for a long time, long enough that the year she had been crowned was, by my reckoning, before my grandfather had been born. She was a fairy. She could change her appearance, which was why she did not look much older than my mother. She could, she added, travel between worlds. Not freely, not often. Once every 2 years for a few hours, before the conditions that allowed the transit pulled her back. My father, she said, had been born here. My father had been born her son. When he was a child, the gods who summoned warriors from Earth for their divine wars had begun targeting him as a high-value asset, a fairy royal with the right body for one of the empty bloodlines they liked to fill. To protect him, she had used a forbidden working to hide him on Earth. She had placed him in a Japanese family. He had grown up there, married my mother, had me, had my sister. Then the gods had located him. They had retrieved him. They had brought him back to this world. They had installed him, against his will, in a political marriage with the 3rd princess of a small eastern kingdom. A marriage that was useful to both sides if you accepted that he was a western continent fairy royal who had been raised on Earth, which the political logic did. Even though the political logic was monstrous, he was alive. He had been here for roughly 11 of my Earth years. He had been depressed. He had not been allowed to write to my mother. He was now traveling toward the imperial capital because she had told him I was here. I did not say anything for a while. She said in a smaller voice that she had visited my mother every 2 years since the retrieval, a few hours each time, bringing what she could. My mother had told me when I was a child that Grandma's house was too far away to visit. I had not asked questions because my mother's face when I asked had not invited them. I asked her, finally, if she could help my classmates take revenge on the Holy King who had summoned them. She said she could help. I asked her if she wanted me to attend the birthday festival. She said yes. I told her I would. I did not say it as a yes to her, exactly. I said it as a yes to the hour she had spent sitting next to my bed without waking me up. 3 days later, I attended the birthday festival. The actual festival had been running for 4 days already. Stalls, free food, parades. The formal day was the emperor's actual birthday, which was the formal party. Grandmother, I was now calling her that out loud, which was a transition that had happened faster than I had expected, had insisted on collecting me at the inn at the appropriate hour. She had also insisted on bringing me to the palace in her own carriage. She had also insisted on choosing my coat, which I had not asked her to do, but which I had not strongly objected to because the coat she had chosen was, somehow, exactly correct. We waited in the antechamber while the announcer worked through the queue ahead of us. Grandmother used the wait to point out, by name and political affiliation, every noble visible from the door. She was very good at it. The thing she did with her face when she was about to deliver an interesting fact was the same thing my mother did with her face when she was about to deliver an interesting fact, and it made my chest do something I had not budgeted for. She also asked, very casually, about Huey. I should have expected that. Huey was riding on Tenchan, my fluffy familiar, in the visible pocket of my coat. Coney had asked us to bring the far distant knights as a kind of demonstration, and Scheherazade had picked the smallest forms for portability. Grandmother saw Huey, asked who had given him to me, and listened carefully to my answer. Her expression went through 3 discrete adjustments while I was speaking. The third adjustment was the one I would remember. She told me, when I was done, that there had not been an eternal night loose in this world since before her grandmother's grandmother had ruled. She told me that the dungeons that produced them had not produced one in 800 years. She told me, in a tone I had not heard her use before, that I had no idea what I was carrying around in my pocket. I told her I would file that information for after dinner. She laughed. The laugh sounded like my mother's laugh. The announcer called us in. Coney was holding court in the way that Coney held court, which is to say he was on the dais, but already looked like he wanted to be off it. He saw me. He smiled in his usual way. He saw my grandmother. His smile became a more carefully constructed object. The Empress saw my grandmother first. She made the kind of face one mature woman makes at another mature woman she has previously not been told existed in the same room as her husband. We approached the dais together. The announcer called both names. Grandmother gave me the gentle elbow that meant I should bow. I bowed at the depth she had quietly demonstrated to me in the antechamber. Coney stood up. Coney came down off the dais. Coney embraced me as though I were a returning relative, which I had previously not realized was the kind of relationship we had. Then he turned to grandmother. He greeted her by a name I had not heard before. She greeted him by a name I had not heard before. They had a short, animated conversation in front of a hall of nobility that had abruptly remembered it was supposed to be looking somewhere else. I would learn, later that evening, that they had known each other for 47 years. I would also learn that the Empress had, in fact, been told my grandmother existed and had been preparing very politely to be unsurprised by all of this. The Empress and I would later have a private conversation about goldfish. The party went on. It was longer than I would have liked and shorter than my grandmother would have liked. I survived it. When I left, grandmother told me she would visit me at the inn the next morning. I told her I would prepare tea. She told me she preferred coffee. I noted that. I went home. Sharon, walking beside me through the cooling night, asked me, not unkindly, whether I had any other relatives in this world I had not mentioned. I told her I would think about it. Grandmother had moved into the inn. She had not asked. She had arrived the morning after the birthday party with 3 trunks, 2 of her attendants, and a complicated explanation about the casino district being stuffy this time of year that had not fooled anyone in the room and had not been intended to. The inn's manager had been notified. The inn's manager had bowed deeply enough that I had been worried about his back. Grandmother now occupied the suite next to mine, and the 2 suites had been connected by a temporary door cut through the partition by an eternal night that grandmother had brought along for that exact purpose. It was not a normal grandmother situation. 3 days passed quickly. Grandmother showed me items from the Otherworld shop she could now purchase using my account access. She had been particularly delighted by Japanese curry powder and a small electric kettle, both of which she had then carried to her suite to investigate at length. She had told me twice that I had her son's eyes. She had told me once that I had her own mother's stubbornness. She had told me a third time that we had so much to talk about. I had agreed. We had not, in fact, talked about most of it. We had drunk a great deal of tea. I was trying to take the relationship at the speed she would let me, which was faster than I had budgeted for and slower than she was capable of going if I had let her. Father arrived on the 3rd morning. I knew he had arrived approximately 15 seconds before he entered the room because Pixie Joe had reported a male individual matching Father's description sprinting up the inn's main staircase, ignoring the protests of staff. The protests were audible through the walls. Pixie Joe gave me a tight assessment of the threat level. Then the door opened. The man who came through the door was not the man I remembered. The man I remembered had been gentle, slight, and a little tired in a way I had not understood as a child, but had understood instantly the moment grandmother had explained her own age. The man who came through the door was muscular, sun-darkened, and emitting the specific volume of a person who had lived for over a decade in a world where being heard was the primary survival skill. He stopped in the doorway. He saw me. He said my name. He crossed the room. He picked me up. He spun me. He cried. I did not have any preparation for any of this. I lasted approximately 11 seconds. Then my brain, which had been running diagnostics for 3 days on the question of how I was going to feel about meeting my father, ran out of mana. I fainted. When I came back, I was on the sofa. Grandmother was holding my hand. Father was sitting on the floor next to the sofa apologizing. He had been apologizing, Sharon reported, for approximately 4 minutes. His voice was almost the one I remembered. I recognized it. I did not recognize the body it was coming out of. The silhouette did not match my memory. I told him so. He went still. He understood. He cried again, more quietly this time. I had also, apparently, gotten taller since he had last seen me. He had not gotten the chance to track that. The third princess of Raymel Kingdom arrived in the suite 10 minutes later. She was, my brain provided helpfully, my stepmother. The thought arrived without permission and was sent back to wherever it had come from. The third princess introduced herself with the formal etiquette of a person who had been raised inside a palace and had been preparing the introduction during her entire ride to the inn. She was tall, dark-haired, late 30s, composed. She apologized for father's intrusion. She apologized for her own intrusion. She thanked me, separately, for being available. She did all of this from across the room because the suite, which had previously fit me and grandmother and Scheherazade and a tea service, had not been designed for an additional 6 visitors. The friction came from her younger attendant. His name was Myro. He was 18 or 19, or somewhere in the range where boys of that age had recently been issued a sword and had not yet been issued the temperament to carry one. He had been told somewhere that his job included protecting Parfait from anything in this room he did not understand, which was most of the things in this room. Sharon proposed very gently that perhaps a smaller meeting in a private room could be arranged for Sage and his immediate family. Myro decided to interpret that as a suggestion that his princess be locked in a room with a strange foreign youth. He said so, loudly. Scheherazade, who had been waiting with the expression of a woman watching a small dog approach a much larger dog, put down her teacup. What followed was a verbal exchange between Scheherazade and Myro that I do not feel qualified to transcribe. The general shape of it was Scheherazade explaining in 3 sentences that she did not think Myro was old enough to be in this room. Myro explained in approximately 12 sentences why he was old enough. Scheherazade observed that the children currently running food stalls outside the inn were more emotionally regulated than he was. The children, who had returned at exactly the wrong moment, agreed with Scheherazade by saying yes in small formal voices, in unison, which was not a thing Timut and Sina had ever previously done in their entire lives. I stood up. I told the room I was going to the orphanage. I told the adults to please discuss the situation among themselves and to please not break the inn. I gathered Timut and Sina and walked out. Father tried to stand up to follow me. Grandmother put a hand on his shoulder. He sat back down. We left. I spent the next 4 hours at the orphanage, eating leftover stew from the previous day's stall sales, watching the orphans do their evening chores, listening to Timut explain the fine details of his pricing strategy to Sienna, and Sienna explaining the fine details of customer relations back to him. They had been doing this for weeks. It was the most calming thing I had encountered in 3 days. I stayed for dinner. I stayed for breakfast. I went back to the inn the next morning. Father was waiting for me when I came back. He was alone. The third princess had returned to her diplomatic quarters. Her young attendant Myro had been formally apologized for by half the Eastern continent's diplomatic corps, in person, by messenger, and by note. Grandmother, per Sharon's report, had spent the last 12 hours threatening war. The third princess had spent the last 12 hours owing grandmother a personal debt that the princess would now never be free of. Grandmother had not actually wanted to threaten war. She had wanted leverage. She had got leverage. Scheherazade had, predictably, made it worse and better in approximately equal measures. None of this was on Father's face when he turned around. He looked tired. He looked apologetic. He stood up and asked me, quietly, if I would come to a small private dinner being held that night by the third princess's diplomatic corps to celebrate his birthday, which was in 2 days, and which he had not yet told me about. I told him no. I told him I had been to one party. The food had been cold. There had been no juice. I was running low on the specific kind of energy that parties demanded. He looked for a half a second like the father I remembered, the one who had told me when I was 6 that grown-ups are sometimes asked to do things they would not have chosen, and that the trick is to be polite about saying no when the answer is no. He laughed. He said in a small voice that he had taught me that. I told him I had remembered. I produced a small box from the otherworld shop. Inside was a smartphone, configured for this world's network, paired with a magic stone charger that ran on goblin stones at 5 charges per stone. I had also, in the last hour, ordered him a magic bag containing every Japanese food item I could remember he had liked. Curry roux, instant coffee, mirin, soy sauce. The specific brand of soup mix he had used to make on Sundays when he had been alive in the world we both came from. I gave him the box. He held it for a long time. He asked me, finally, without looking up, if I had decided what I was going to do. I told him I was going to visit grandmother's country first as sightseeing, then his home as sightseeing. Then I was going to figure out how to go back to my mother. I used the word sightseeing in both sentences because I did not have the strength to say it any other way. He understood the word. He nodded. He said, "Okay, sightseeing." He said it twice. He used it the same way I had. He thanked me for the phone. He asked if he could call me sometime. I told him yes. I told him not too often. He laughed. He said he had remembered that lesson too. He left. I sat in the chair he had been sitting in. I did not move for a while. We left the imperial capital 1 week after father's smartphone. The trip to grandmother's country was, in theory, a straightforward voyage along the established merchant route. We took a coach to the port. We boarded a merchant ship that grandmother had vetted personally. We had cabins, supplies, time, and a luxury tent expanded by Scheherazade in the lower hold to accommodate the horse dragons. Coney came to the harbor to see us off and pretended he was not affected by it. Grandmother spent the first day rearranging her cabin in a way that suggested she planned to live there forever. The children spent the first day discovering that a ship's deck was a thing. The first 3 days were uneventful. On the 4th night, Pixie Joe woke me. The fairy was sitting on my pillow when I opened my eyes. He told me, in his usual flat tone, that sea monsters had detected the ship and would arrive within 5 minutes. He had already woken Scheherazade. I was the last on his list because I was, he had observed, the slowest waker in the group. I did not argue. I cast Strong Saint's sanctuary around the cabin walls, then around the ship's hull, then around every passenger I could identify by mana signature, which was most of them. Grandmother caught me casting the 3rd layer and tried to scold me about mana depletion. I told her my mana was fine. She told me her grandson had her son's eyes and her own stubbornness in roughly equal proportion. I did not have a response for that. The first impact came at 4 minutes 30 seconds. The ship rocked. The second impact came at 5 minutes flat. The ship lifted. I activated Saint's Radiance with the glow suppressed. The ship rose, peaked, and came down. The barrier held. The hull cracked along the keel, and we landed sideways on a rocky shore. The barrier held. The keel parted. The barrier held. We came to rest at an angle of about 30 degrees. The kids cheered as if this had been a planned amusement. Pixie Joe scouted ahead while I was still sitting up. He came back 6 minutes later with the report. We had landed near the island of death. The forested side was north. The rocky side, where we were, was south. There was a dungeon at the southern end. Dark dungeon, marked unsafe by the Merchant Guild for over a century. The merchant ship's owner had also already mobilized. By morning, he and the noble who had threatened us boarding had monopolized the freshwater barrels and the 2 surviving small boats. They had announced that anyone who wanted access to either would have to demonstrate their political worth. Sharon, observing this from above the chaos, used the phrase she had been waiting for over a year to use. She said, "I get it. Another flag for Saj Sama's one-man army." Scheherazade asked me, with the politely interested tone of a woman waiting for permission to do violence, how I would like to proceed. I suggested the dungeon. The Island of Death was, it turned out, an undead-themed dungeon. 200 floors, skeletons, wraiths, the occasional intelligent revenant, everything that could make a normal adventuring party miserable for months at a time. The dungeon had been on the Merchant Guild's avoid list since before the Empire had existed. We cleared it in a week. Scheherazade and Ashereshika handled most of the actual fighting. My contribution was barrier maintenance and looting, which had become my specialty in a way I had not budgeted for early in life. The barrier rendered the floor's monsters unable to enter our personal space, which meant Scheherazade and Ashereshika could engage one at a time at our convenience, while I picked up everything that dropped after the fight. I had a list. The list grew. By the 3rd floor, I had stopped checking the list. By the 7th floor, I had a magic bag dedicated to dungeon rewards from this specific island. By the 40th, I had filled the magic bag and started a second. The grandmother and her elderly travel companion, a Western continent dwarf named Tears, who I had not previously met because he had been gambling in a corner of the cabin for the entire first 3 days, set up a beach camp on the rocky shore in our absence. Scheherazade had pre-positioned the camp with everything they needed. They took the dungeon week as a vacation. Grandmother told me later, twice that she had not eaten so well in 100 years. Tears told me, once, that he had not been so drunk in slightly less than 100 years. The merchant ship's surviving passengers on the forested north side were rationing water. Children were being kept indoors against the threat of monsters that were not coming because the dungeon's mana density had pulled most of the island's wildlife into itself. Some of the noble's retinue began crossing to our side after day 3. Scheherazade fed them. The noble himself remained on his side. He did not cross. On day 7, we cleared floor 200. The dungeon's reward chamber granted me a skill I had not earned through combat. Apparently clearing a dungeon while never hitting a monster directly still counted as clearing. That allowed me to identify the spatial signature of nearby dungeons within a wider radius. I did not know what to do with that yet. I filed it. Ashur-Shika revealed she had a ship. She had acquired it 2 years ago. She had been keeping it in her personal storage, waiting for the right occasion. Scheherazade had done the customizations during our dungeon week. Interior expansion, simulated outdoor space for the horse dragons, plumbed kitchen, a reading library, and a small training arena. The ship was, Scheherazade clarified, larger than any vessel currently in use on this hemisphere's commercial routes. I asked Scheherazade very directly whether she had arranged for our ship to be wrecked. She told me she had not. She told me, in a tone that suggested I should drop the question, that she had not needed to. I dropped the question. We boarded Ashur-Shika's luxury cruise the morning after. The merchant ship's owner and the noble who had hoarded the water arrived at the makeshift port we had constructed and asked, with very different volume levels, to be allowed to board. Scheherazade refused. The noble produced a document that was supposed to give him priority access to imperial transport. Scheherazade produced a different document, one she had prepared specifically for this contingency 3 days earlier in her cabin, with materials she had brought along. That demonstrated his title was a central continent fabrication, and the original lineage he claimed had been extinct for 40 years. The noble went through 3 colors. He was last seen sitting on a rock with his head in his hands. We left him there. Scheherazade reported him to the Imperial Communications Office as a shipwreck victim of unknown origin in need of Western Continent rescue, which generated diplomatic paperwork in 2 countries and would, by Sharon's calculation, take approximately 6 months to resolve. The voyage to the Western Continent took half a month. The ship had everything I would have asked for if I had thought to ask. It also had everything Scheherazade and Ashur-Shika had thought to ask for, which was significantly more. Grandmother announced halfway through that she was not getting off when we arrived. The dwarf agreed. Both of them were ignored. It was on this ship that I learned what Haruto and Sharone thought of me. Sharone told me first. She had been watching me, she said, since the day we had purchased her in the Holy Kingdom, with the constant low-grade vigilance of a person who had once been a star actress and could read tone in any conversation. She told me, on a quiet afternoon on the viewing deck, that she had spent the first 3 months of our acquaintance certain I was going to break, that someone treated by a king the way I had been treated, then asked to build something this large, would eventually crack, and that her job, as she understood it, was to be in the room when it happened. She told me that month somewhere on the northern continent journey she had stopped expecting it. She told me, with her ears at a particular angle, that she had not realized I would not break, that I would just keep working until the world adjusted around me, that she found this somewhat alarming and somewhat relieving. I asked her if it had been alarming or relieving more recently. She said relieving. She said it the way she said most things about us, which was without further elaboration. Haruto's version came through the smartphone 2 days later, in a long voice message he had sent during a quiet evening at his Eastern Continent Inn. He told me, in his usual loose voice, that he had been afraid of me since high school, that he had been there the day I had retaliated against the kids who had hurt my sister, that he had decided that day that he would never want me angry at him for any reason. He told me he had come to this world half glad because he thought the system would weaken me, the way it had given him stats higher than mine. He told me the moment he had seen me obtain a level 2000 Eternal Night Golem out of a treasure chest on the seafloor, he had realized the system had not weakened me at all. He had been quietly terrified for several weeks afterward. Then, he said, he had realized I had not used any of it on him or Mamoru, that I would not, and that the protectiveness he had been afraid of had only ever been pointed outward, never at us. He had stopped being afraid. He had started being grateful. He apologized for the surveillance. I did not have a frame for any of that. I went to the kitchen. I made dinner. Sharon came in and watched me make dinner. I made enough for everyone. We ate. The ship sailed on. We arrived at the Western Continent 14 days later. The Western Continent port town was the most diverse place I had ever been. I had been told by grandmother, on the ship, that the Western continent's racial composition was significantly more varied than the Empire's, but I had not been prepared for what that looked like in practice. Beastfolk of every imaginable variant. Pixies the size of house cats riding on shoulders. Elves with the kind of pointed ears I had previously assumed were a fantasy stereotype. Dwarves who were taller than me and built like blacksmiths. The crowd looked, to my earth-trained eye, like every fantasy genre book I had ever read had decided to vacation in the same town. Grandmother and her retinue had gone ahead to the noble-only inn for the entry procedures. Scheherazade had stored the cruise ship in her item box, much to the harbor's astonishment, and had gone with grandmother to handle the diplomatic paperwork. I had been left with Sharoe, Temut, and Sina to entertain ourselves until the formalities cleared. We ate. I had not eaten Western continent food before. The vendor at the third stall, a beastman with stripes I could not identify, noticed our exchange of an Eastern coin and gently informed us that Western continent currency had a higher mineral content, and we were probably losing about 30% on every transaction. Sharon went to the Commerce Guild to exchange properly. The children pulled me to a fourth stall. By the sixth stall, I had eaten more skewered meat than I had eaten in my life, and was sitting on a crate trying to remember how digestion worked. That was when I noticed the hair ornament, small, silver, some kind of leaf design, lying on the cobblestones near the next stall over, where a noblewoman had passed 5 minutes earlier. I had a soft impulse to return it. The impulse made me stand up. The impulse made me bend down to pick it up. The impulse made me, in retrospect, an extraordinarily easy target. Something hit me from behind. It hit me with the kind of force you get from a loaded shipping crate moving fast. There was, my brain recorded somewhere in the half second of consciousness that remained, a man behind it. There was, somewhere in the same half second, a panicked expression on his face that did not match the precision with which he had executed the strike. Then the world went sideways. I woke up in a holding cell. There was a slave collar on my neck. I noted this with the kind of detachment I had developed over the last year of my life. The collar had not activated because my Saint's Sanctuary barrier was a permanent passive field that neutralized restraint effects on contact. The collar would, technically, have looked like a slave collar to any observer. It was now just an unusually heavy necklace that did nothing. I sat up. There were other captives in the chamber, 12 of them, children mostly, with 2 older teenagers, various races. They had been there for differing amounts of time based on the dirt of their tunics. The collars on their necks were active. One of the teenagers was an elf girl. Her hair had been pulled back roughly enough that the gold circlet she had been wearing was bent. She had sharp green eyes that were currently being used to measure me. She told me in a flat voice that the man who had struck me had specialized in shipping high-value targets to a slave auction that ran every 2 weeks on the continent's interior. We had 4 days. She also told me, in the same flat voice, that she recognized my face. She told me my grandmother had been her grandmother's friend for over 50 years. I asked her her name. She said it was Era. I told her grandmother and mine were going to have words about her absence later. I cast Saint's Sanctuary on every other prisoner in the room. Their collars went inert. The chamber's stone walls developed the same minor pressure flicker my own cell had developed in the church's holding facility. I activated Saintess Wish Door, a teleportation skill I had been using for routine transport between the Imperial capital and the Wasteland farm, targeting the farm's open central courtyard. The door opened in midair in the middle of the chamber. I sent the children through one at a time. They went without protest because they had nowhere better to go, and because Scheherazade's subordinates were waiting on the other side, having been notified by Pixie Joe approximately 30 seconds earlier. Ira refused to go through the door. She told me, in a tone I had previously only heard from grandmother, that she was not a child to be sent somewhere safe while the adults handled the situation. She was an elf noble of the Western continent. She had been kidnapped on her own continent by her own continent's slavers. She intended to be present for the response. I did not have an effective argument for any of those points. She joined the group. The kidnappers fled when they realized their inventory had disappeared. We left the holding facility through the front door. Pixie Joe scouted ahead. The town's street was sunny. I had been unconscious for approximately 3 hours. The next day, grandmother's country was invaded. I had not even fully recovered from the kidnapping when the messenger reached us. A neighboring human nation had crossed the border with 6,000 soldiers organized in standard infantry formation. The neighboring nation, Era explained on the carriage ride to the front, had been suffering food shortages from a regional drought combined with the central continent's civil war, and had decided that solving the problem by invading a fairy kingdom they considered politically irrelevant was simpler than asking for help. Grandmother's intelligence network had identified the assault 3 days ago. Grandmother had evacuated the affected villages and let the army advance into ground of her choosing. Grandmother had asked for me specifically. She had been very clear that she did not want me involved in killing. She also did not want 6,000 human soldiers killed if there was an alternative. She had hoped I might think of one. We arrived at the fortress an hour before the army's first wave was scheduled to begin. The fortress was old, gray stone and green ivy, and a wide plain in front of it. The army was visible across the plain, not yet in arrow range, but mobilized, with the kind of organized confidence that came from believing the opposition could be brushed aside. The commander rode out front on a heavy warhorse in steel and red, wearing a red cape that flared in a way that suggested someone had told him it was intimidating, and he had believed them. I stood in front of the fortress with Grandmother on my left, and Sharon, Ira, Timut, and Sienna behind me. Grandmother shouted something at the commander. I am not going to repeat what she said, because Grandmother is my grandmother, and the things she said included details about the commander's personal life, his lineage, his political competence, and his intimate hygiene. The commander, who had not been prepared for verbal hostilities and had been prepared for a polite war, lost his composure within the first 12 seconds and ordered a charge. The first wave came. I cast Strong Saint's sanctuary across the plain in front of the fortress. The arrows stopped. The siege bolts stopped. The first wave of soldiers reached the barrier line and walked into a transparent stone wall they could not see and could not pass. I had 30 seconds before the commander adjusted his approach. I activated Item Box. Item Box at maximum range, when set to a category instruction rather than a specific item, can perform a categorical extraction across its entire effective area. I had used the skill in this configuration twice before, both times in dungeon contexts, both times to collect treasure that had spilled when a chest broke. I had never used it on a battlefield. The configuration was simple. The instruction set was simpler. Specify category: weapons, armor, fabric clothing, leather goods, plant-derived materials, monster-derived materials, magic items. Specify range: my barrier perimeter. Execute. The skill executed in approximately 1 second. 6,000 soldiers stood in formation across the plain. They were not wearing anything. Their weapons, their armor, their boots, their cloaks, their tunics, their underthings, their leather belts, their canvas tents in the rear, the leather coverings on their shields, the wooden halves of their spears, the canvas of the siege engines. Every piece of gear they had with them, gone. All of it was now in my item box. I had the inventory open in front of me. The list was long. The army stood there. Nobody charged. Nobody could. They had nothing to charge with. They also had no clothes. The commander, who had been mounted, was now sitting on a horse he no longer had a saddle on, wearing the expression of a man whose career had just been removed from his body without his consent. Grandmother, beside me, made a sound. It was not a laugh exactly. It was the sound of a woman who had been waiting for a very long time to see the human nations of the Western continent embarrassed at the political level, and had not quite expected to see it embarrassed at the personal level all at the same time. I produced several thousand wool blankets from the item box and stacked them in a neat pile at the edge of the barrier perimeter. I told the commander, in a normal speaking volume that the barrier amplified to carry across the plain, that he was welcome to retrieve the blankets if he could organize a non-hostile approach. I told him his army would not be allowed to advance further, and that the blankets were the most generous thing he was going to receive from this engagement. The commander did not respond. He could not. He was attempting to discover whether his horse had been left him with any dignity at all. The army began retreating, one blanketed soldier at a time. It took the rest of the afternoon. Nobody was hurt. Grandmother's official report would later describe the engagement as the most decisive non-combat resolution of an invasion in continental military history. Scheherazade kept the report. She framed it. The commander never appeared in another invasion. We crossed the border 3 days later. Grandmother had decided, with a strategic eye I had not previously appreciated, that the best response to a failed invasion was not retaliation, but charity. The neighboring nation's villages were starving. The soldiers we had sent home naked were going home to families who had been hungry for months. Grandmother had announced formally that the Forest Kingdom would extend food relief to any village that publicly disavowed continued hostility. Scheherazade had drafted the proclamation. Ashurashika had organized the supply chain. I had been put in charge of the cooking because I was, by Scheherazade's quiet assessment, the only one of us with enough patience for the line management. The first village's cooking pot was the largest cooking pot I had ever owned. Scheherazade had pulled it from her item box. It was military grade. It held, by my rough estimate, enough porridge for 600 people. The line stretched out of sight. Villagers had to bring their own bowls. They did. I cooked. Ira handled distribution. The children handed bowls. I was halfway through the second pot when Radha's father stepped out of the line. He was carrying something wrapped in a thin gray cloth. He was thinner than the rest of the line. His eyes had the particular hollow that grief leaves when grief has run out of energy and has settled into the muscle. He told me, without looking up, that his daughter had died 5 days ago. She had eaten poisonous wild grass because she had been hungry. He had kept her body. He could not afford a burial. He had heard, on the road into the village, that the fairy queen's grandson could revive the dead within a week. He asked, without lifting his eyes, if it was true. I had used Saint's Miracle 3 times in my entire life. All 3 had been in the church's holding facility. The skill description had updated since then. The window had extended from 1 hour to 1 week, and the description had acquired an addendum that read approximately, "He cannot think of things that cannot happen. By stacking and using in combination, it can also be done." I did not know what that meant. I did not have time to know what that meant. I told him to put her down on the cloth I unrolled in front of me. He did. He stepped back. He waited. I performed Saint's Miracle. The light was not dramatic. There was a soft glow. There was a held breath, mine and his, and probably the village's. There was a child's small voice asking for her father in the syllable a small child uses for that word in this world's common tongue. The father did not move for several seconds. Then he picked her up. Then he sat down on the dirt of his own street and sobbed in the quiet, complete way of someone who has been holding something heavy for 5 days and has just been allowed to put it down. The line behind him went quiet. Then it began to move forward in a slightly different way, with an attention that had not been there a minute earlier. Several more bodies were brought from neighboring houses over the next 2 hours. Some had been dead too long. Some had not. I did what I could. I told the ones I could not help that I was sorry. They thanked me anyway, because I had fed them, and because I had been honest about what I could and could not do. I thought about Radha for the rest of that week. I still do, sometimes. We worked through 6 villages over the next 11 days. Grandmother's offer of food relief was accepted in all 6. The neighboring nation's government, which had fled their own capital after the army's return, sent a delegation to Grandmother requesting peace terms. Grandmother negotiated quietly. The Forest Kingdom acquired coastal access. The neighboring nation acquired food. The villagers acquired the knowledge that the people they had been told were enemies were, in fact, the people who had bothered to feed them. Ira told me, on the carriage ride back, that I was the strangest war hero the continent had ever produced. I told her I was not a war hero. I had not killed anyone. She told me that was the point. The dungeon city was 10 days' travel inland from the coast. Between us and the dungeon city, by Era's map, were 7 towns of a small human supremacist nation that had not yet decided whether the Forest Kingdom's recent embarrassment of its neighbors was something to be afraid of, indignant about, or strategically opportunistic with regard to. The town we were currently standing in had taken the third option. They had welcomed our money to their inn and were planning to pretend that beastfolk and demi-humans were not real for the duration of our visit. I had been told by Era that this was the friendliest reception we were going to get for the next 10 days. I hired 3 beastmen adventuring parties as escort and protection before we crossed the border. I knew the Bear Beastman party from the Empire. They had volunteered the moment they had heard of the trip. 2 more parties from the Imperial Guild had been recommended. They were all experienced. They all knew the social terrain. None of them wanted to do this. All of them did it anyway. Before entering the first town, I gave every beastman in the party a small mechanical device from the Otherworld shop, a click counter, the kind that you used at a kitchen to count how many guests had walked through your door. I told them, plainly, that I wanted them to click the counter every time someone insulted them. I wanted data. They looked at each other. The wolf beastman from the bear party asked me, in his usual flat way, if I was serious. I was serious. In the first town, the counters recorded 47 insults in 2 hours. The soup kitchen we set up in the central square fed 300 people. I noted both numbers in my operational log. I did not editorialize. The numbers spoke for themselves. We did this in 3 more towns over the next 4 days. The counters acquired clicks. The soup kitchen acquired customers. The customers ate. The 5th town was where it changed. The local lord arrived at the soup kitchen on horseback in the late afternoon with 8 armed retainers, formally robed and outraged. He had been signaling for hours that we were to relocate operations to his manor and serve only those his court vetted. We had ignored every messenger. He arrived in person to deliver his outrage at the appropriate volume. He began the formal grievance. He had not yet finished the second sentence when one of his own guards stepped forward and arrested him. The guard was a young woman in the Lord's livery. She was calm. She was specific. She had clearly been thinking about this for some time. She announced to her own captain and to the watching crowd that the Lord had been hoarding grain reserves while his town's residents starved, and that the militia code of the Lord's own kingdom, a clause her father had quoted to her since she was a child, included provision for arresting nobility under specific civic violation conditions. She named the clause. She named the date the Lord had begun hoarding. She named the volume of grain he had hidden. The Lord went through 3 colors. The captain looked at the guard. The captain looked at the Lord. The captain put his hand on the Lord's shoulder. The Lord was removed. The young guard turned to me. She thanked me. She asked formally if the soup kitchen could continue. I told her it could. She bowed once and stepped back into formation, as if the entire incident had been a routine procedure. We worked through midnight. The line had grown by an order of magnitude. Word had spread to neighboring villages. Scheherazade extended the supply pull. We left eventually through Saintus Wish door, with the soldiers thanking us as we went, and the young guard standing watch in the square with the kind of expression I had not previously associated with people who served lords. I noted it in my operational log. The dungeon city of Satsi territory was nothing like the imperial capital. It was smaller. It was newer. It was loud in the specific way cities are loud when half the population is between 16 and 30, and the other half is making money off them. The skyline was dominated by the Explorers Guild building, 3 stories tall, copper-roofed, with a banner above the front door that I could read at 4 blocks distance. The streets were full of adventurers, in armor pretending to be casual, merchants pretending to be busy, and locals pretending neither group was their problem. There was a permanent food market 2 streets over from the Explorers Guild that ran on dungeon-acquired ingredients. There was, somewhere underground at the city's center, the dungeon entrance itself. Era had secured a high-end inn before we arrived. She had also negotiated a contract with a merchant contact for 14 pieces of jewelry from the northern continent at a price Sharon took one look at and immediately renegotiated without asking. The children went to the Explorers Guild to register because they had decided on the carriage ride that they were going to do at least 1 dungeon run during this stay, and they were not going to let me forget it. I bought coffee. I ordered a choux pastry from a street stall. I sat down at an outdoor table near the Explorers Guild Plaza. I drank the coffee. I ate the pastry. I watched the city move. I had not been anonymous in any city since approximately my 2nd week in the Empire. The fact that I was anonymous now, for the next 35 seconds, was the most pleasant experience I had had in 3 weeks. The 35 seconds ended. A noblewoman across the plaza stopped walking and pointed at me. She told her companion, in a stage whisper that traveled significantly farther than she intended, that the man at the table was either the Forest Queen's grandson or had been mistaken for him on at least 3 previous occasions, and, either way, they should send a message to the Aristolio Trading Company. I sighed. I drank the rest of the coffee. I needed money. The cruise ship had cost more than I had wanted to spend, and the village relief operations had drawn down our reserves more than Sharon had budgeted for. The dungeon city had a coin dungeon. The coin dungeon, by Era's advanced research, had hidden treasure rooms on the early floors that other adventurers skipped because they were not efficient. The coin dungeon was, in the casual phrasing my instincts used, a flag. I was, at that point, going to walk into the flag voluntarily because it was the easiest path to the money I needed. Sharon, joining me at the table, watched me think this through and predicted, with one eyebrow raised, exactly what I was about to say. I told her I was going to the dungeon tomorrow. She told me she had already booked the inn for 2 weeks. I hired 2 bear beastman children at the dungeon entrance the next morning. They had approached me at the gate offering services as porters. Their parents had been working the dungeon's lower floors and had not been paid in 3 weeks because the Explorers Guild had a quiet policy of delaying beastman labor pay until the next funding cycle. The children had heard of me. They had been hoping I would arrive. The 11-year-old brother did the negotiating. The 9-year-old sister carried the harness. I hired them at 3 times the standard porter rate. I paid the first day in advance. I bought them warm amazake from the Otherworld shop while we waited at the entrance plaza. They drank it in 3 sips each and asked, in the kind of voice you use when you are not sure if you are allowed to ask, whether the warm, sweet thing was a permanent pay item or just for today. I told them it was for every day. We entered the dungeon at the second hour after sunrise. My method was unconventional. The coin dungeon's standard adventurer route skipped the early floors for efficiency. Those floors only contained copper coins, and the experienced parties wanted silver and gold. The early floors also contained hidden treasure rooms that nobody bothered to find because the time investment was not worth it for copper. I had a treasure detection skill from the Otherworld shop that made the time investment trivial. I located every hidden room on every floor we passed. The bear children carried the chests we collected. By the third floor, they were no longer carrying chests because Ashereshika had revealed her own item box, and the children's role had transitioned into the much easier task of opening doors and taking notes on what we found. By the seventh floor, we had a problem. The chests were full of money. The item box was full of money. The dungeon was operating by the children's count at 6 times the income of an experienced full combat party. The bear children kept asking, in increasingly polite voices, if I was sure they were allowed to be here. I told them yes. I told them they were on payroll. I told them I would write them a guild reference letter at the end of the week that would get them either porter work or apprentice work at any guild on the continent. I told them, when the 11-year-old finally asked, that yes, they could send half their pay to their parents. The sister stopped to wipe her face on her sleeve in the way you do when you do not want anyone to notice you are crying. I pretended I had not noticed. We went down to the 8th floor. The dungeon's safe rooms were neutral magical spaces between floors where no monster would attack. They had benches. They had small fountains. They had a kind of soft glow that made you want to stop and rest. We had been using them as lunch stops. On the gold coin floor, on the 3rd day of our run, I walked into a safe room and found Haruto sitting on a bench eating a cold pork bun. I had not seen him since the morning he had left the dormitory. He saw me first. His face did the entire sequence of expressions in approximately 1 second. Recognition, joy, the quick check that I was in fact whole and intact, the loose grin that meant he had decided not to make a scene about it. He waved at me with the pork bun. He told me, with his mouth full, that he had been hoping the dungeon city's traffic patterns would put us in the same dungeon eventually. His party was with him, 4 of them, a dwarf knight, an elf mage, a human paladin, a demi-human ranger I would later learn was a vampire. They were all watching me with the particular intensity of adventurers who had heard rumors about a forest queen's grandson and were now confirming the rumors had not been exaggerated. 2 of them were transmigrators. The elf mage was a woman from Yokohama who had been here for 6 years. The vampire ranger was a man from Osaka who had been here for 14. They had been with Haruto's party for the last 4 months. They had not had Japanese food in years. I produced a kitchen from the Otherworld shop in the center of the safe room. The dungeon's mana absorbed it without complaint. Safe rooms accept stable spatial expansion. I made rice, miso soup, tamagoyaki, salt-grilled mackerel. Both transmigrators were crying before the rice was done. They tried not to. They failed. Haruto pretended he was not affected. He was. The dwarf knight asked with deep suspicion whether the small flat orange thing on his plate was eaten with a fork or with the fingers. The elf mage hit him gently on the arm. I gave each transmigrator a disposable Otherworld shop terminal, a simplified version of my own catalog access, locked to 1 item type per use, designed so they could buy specific small things from Earth without destabilizing local economies. They held the terminals like sacred objects. The vampire told me, in a quiet voice, that he was going to use his to buy chocolate and was not sorry about it. We compared notes. Haruto had been adventuring through the eastern continent and had recently arrived at the western continent's dungeon city for the same reason I had, money, after a long stretch of operations. He had heard about the Forest Queen invasion. He had heard about the army stripping. He had laughed for a documented 40 minutes when the news had reached him. He was already drafting a song about it. The bear children listened to all of this without saying anything because they were eating tamagoyaki and they did not, at that moment, have the resources for additional conversation. We agreed to dungeon together for the next several days. Haruto's party was at our pace. My method was, the dwarf knight said, refreshingly absurd. On the 5th day, I found the bonus stage. It was in the dungeon guidebook, a specific edition Era had bought at a stall the previous night that included regional dungeon notes the standard guides did not. The note for the coin dungeon included included a footnote in small print describing a skull-marked icon in the gold coin floor's western corridor. Anyone who could find the icon could enter the bonus stage. Nobody had documented entering it in the last 40 years. I found the icon in approximately 12 minutes because I had a treasure detection skill that recognized the icon as a flagged anomaly in the floor's spatial layout. I did not bring Haruto with me. I would later realize this had been a small breach of friendship etiquette and would have to apologize for it. At the time, I went in with Ashurashika because she had asked with a particular tilt of her head if I could go just with her. She had been operating in shared environments for a long time and had not had much one-on-one time with me. The bonus stage was a circular chamber, approximately 80 feet across, filled, at first count, with 200 Dullahan boss-class enemies in the polished armor of dead generals. I cast Strong Saint's Sanctuary across the chamber. Ashurashika handled the rest. She was, by quiet calculation, the strongest individual member of my household. She had been built, designed, and stat allocated for combat in environments where the situation could be reduced to a single unrelenting variable. The bonus chamber's situation could be reduced to a single variable. The Dullahan went down at a rate of approximately 7 per minute. They had been intended to overwhelm a normal party of 6 adventurers who would have used skill and tactics. Ashurashika did not use skill or tactics. She used the fact that her sword could cut through high-tier armor in a single horizontal motion, and the fact that the Dullahan kept lining up obligingly to attack the barrier and being trapped by it. The chamber was clear in approximately 28 minutes. The reward chest at the chamber's center contained a coin. The coin was rainbow-colored, the size of my palm, and shimmered when I picked it up. The Otherworld shop's price catalog flagged it as a rainbow star coin. Internal value, 100 billion shop currency units. I sat down on the chamber floor. I sat there for some time. Ashurashika, standing behind me, observed that I was sitting on the floor. I told her I knew. She said, in a tone I had not previously heard from her, that the ship had been expensive, but the ship was now affordable. I told her, looking at the coin still in my hand, that the ship was now extremely affordable. She told me she was glad. She also told me, after a respectful pause, that I should perhaps stand up before Haruto came looking for me, because Haruto would never let me live it down. I stood up. We left the bonus stage. Haruto did not see me sit. The bear children were still on the gold coin floor finishing up the morning's chest collection. I gave them an extra silver coin each as bonus. We finished the dungeon week 3 days later. I left the dungeon on the morning of the 7th day with 3 item boxes full of coin, 1 rainbow star coin in my personal pocket, and the financial floor of every operation I had ever run for the rest of my probable lifetime. I went back to the inn. Ira was at the inn's reception desk talking to the inn's manager. The inn's manager looked extremely pale. Ira looked at me. Her expression was halfway between professional and the particular type of barely contained fury that a person reaches after sitting on bad news for too long. She told me, in her professional tone, that there had been a development. She told me a local lord had thrown Sharon into a dungeon under his castle 2 days earlier. The lord had also disappeared 3 Aristolio Trading Company employees the day before that. Ira had been recovering them with the help of the bear party while I was in the bonus stage. Sharon was still down there. Ashurashika, by Ira's account, had known the situation for at least one of those 2 days and had not told me. I noticed at that moment that I was holding the rainbow star coin in my left hand instead of in my pocket where I had previously placed it. I did not remember moving it. I asked Ira to repeat what she had just said. She repeated it. I put the coin in my pocket. I turned around and walked toward the front door. The Lord's castle was as large as the Holy King's castle on the central continent. I noted this with the kind of detachment I had developed over the previous year of my life. A castle of that scale required a particular kind of resource extraction to maintain. The local nobility could not afford that kind of resource extraction through legitimate means in a region with this kind of food crisis. The math implied things about the Lord's operations that the Lord had not made any effort to hide. Ashurashika and I were led to a guest reception room and asked to wait. The escort offered no refreshments. The reception room was decorated. The decorations were clustered along the room's south wall in a pattern that did not match the room's other features. I noted this. Ashurashika noted this. Neither of us said anything. The Lord himself did not arrive. The Lord's son did. He was approximately 28 years old. His hair was slicked back in a way that suggested he had been working on the look since the moment we had been announced. He sat down across from us. He did not offer tea. He looked at me with an expression expression that he had probably practiced in front of a mirror until the expression was the face. He told me, in a voice that intended to be cutting, that I smelled like a beastman's plaything and looked like I could not afford a proper bath. I told him I used a modern cleansing solution morning and night, and that, between us, I was the one in this room who had money. His face did the thing faces do when they have not been prepared for this specific response. He gestured. 6 soldiers in the Lord's livery stepped from behind the tapestries on the south wall and moved toward us. The barrier I had been holding for the entire conversation prevented them from reaching the sofa. The Lord's son, with the kind of poorly suppressed satisfaction of a man whose final card is also his only card, depressed a small lever hidden in the right armrest of his own chair. The floor opened. I had time to be irritated about this for approximately 3/4 of a second. Ashurashika looked sideways at me. She had not moved. I activated Saint's radiance with the floating effect, and the glow suppressed. Ashurashika and I floated. The sofa we had been sitting on did not. The Lord's son had not been prepared for the floating. He had also not been prepared for me in the same moment, asking him very politely whether he had remembered to brief his soldiers about his trapdoor mechanism, because 2 of the soldiers were currently halfway across the falling sofa and were not themselves floating. The trapdoor took 2 of his own men. The Lord's son's face went through 3 colors. I told him I was going down the trapdoor voluntarily because I needed to retrieve someone of mine he had thrown into his dungeon 2 days earlier. I told him not to leave town. I told him Ashurashika had memorized his face. He sat on his chair as if his chair had taken the air out of his body. We descended. The bottom of the trapdoor opened into a cavern. The cavern was larger than I had expected. The ceiling was lit by clustered luminescent ore. The floor was wide enough to hold what I could only describe as a settlement, not a camp. Huts, stalls, a meeting tent, smoke from cooking fires. Approximately 300 residents at first count. The settlement existed because the Lord's family had been operating this trapdoor for approximately 2 generations. The dungeon below the castle was a low-level cave spider dungeon that the Lord's people had cleared out floors ago and then converted to a labor system. People who fell through the trapdoor were used to mine the cavern's ore, which was sold by the family on the legal mineral market. People who survived the fall and the work formed a community at the base of the trapdoor because the only exit was a high shaft that led to a dangerous mountain peak. Ashurashika and I floated down to the cavern floor. The settlement noticed us immediately. They had developed protocols. 2 guards approached. They were polite. They asked where we had come from and which faction we identified with. I told them I was not identifying with a faction. I told them I was looking for a specific person. I gave them Sharon's description. They told me, with the polite certainty of people who had been answering this question for 100 years, that the White Fox Beast Girl in the new merchant tent was probably the person I was looking for. I asked as a follow-up what the new merchant tent was. They told me, with even more polite certainty, that the new merchant tent had been established 4 days ago by a White Fox Beast Girl who had announced on her arrival at the settlement that she was a merchant, that she would be buying any drop items the settlement's combatants did not want, that she would be selling food at imperial slum prices, and that she had explicitly disrupted the settlement's previous economic structure by announcing free food for all non-combatants on her first afternoon. The 2 guards walked us across the dome. The new merchant tent was the largest tent I could see. It had a queue. The queue was made up of beastfolk and a few human residents holding drop items I recognized as basic spider cave loot. At the head of the queue, behind a small wooden counter, sat a White Fox Beast Girl with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair tied back in a knot rather than her usual ribbon, and a leather ledger open in front of her. She was negotiating drop item prices with a dwarf S-rank adventurer who had clearly given up trying to argue with her. I stopped at the back of the queue. She finished the negotiation. She wrote a number into the ledger. She signed the receipt. She handed the dwarf a small bag of food. The dwarf left with the expression of a person who had just been managed expertly. Sharon looked up at the next person in line. The next person in line was me. She looked at me. I looked at her. She finished her sentence. 8 food rations for that haul. Take it or leave it. To a beastman who had not yet spoken. She signed off on the deal. She closed the ledger. She turned to the dwarf and the cat beastmen who were assisting her and asked them, in her professional tone, if they could handle the queue for a few minutes. Then she looked at me again. I told her very quietly that she had been busy. She told me in the same voice that she had been bored. We stood there for a few seconds without saying anything else. She did not hug me. I did not hug her. Both of us would have, several months earlier, found a reason to. Both of us, several months later, did did not feel the need to. The not hugging was its own kind of communication. She handed me the ledger. She showed me the trade economy she had built. She had been there 4 days. She had moved approximately 30% of the settlement's stockpiled drop items, distributed 8 days of food across 243 non-combatants, and negotiated a price floor for any future trade between the settlement and any rescue force that might arrive. The rescue force was now me, and I noticed the floor was favorable. She showed me, last, a list of names. The list was titled Imprisoned Children. The list had 3 names. There were 3 children in the tent: a 6-year-old human passing boy with a single small horn on his forehead and dark red eyes that watched me without blinking; a 6-year-old beastfolk boy with feline ears and a tawny tail who was holding the first boy's hand in the casual way of children who had decided to be each other's most reliable adult; and, between them, a toddler, approximately 2 years old, with messy dark brown hair and an expression that did not match a 2-year-old's face. I crouched down. The toddler looked at me. The toddler asked me, in clear adult syntax that should not have been possible from a child his size, whether I was a reincarnator. He asked it without preamble. He asked it without the kind of buildup an adult would have used. He asked it with the absolute certainty of a person who had met other displaced people before and could recognize the signature. I told him yes. He nodded once. He told me he had thought so. He told me in the same level voice that the demon-eared boy was the demon king's son, that the cat-eared boy was the beast king's son, that he himself had been born in the small kingdom of Eastern Pelin and was, in this body, the only surviving member of his family's line, that he had been held in this dungeon for 3 weeks. The other 2 had been here for 2 months and 1 month, respectively. The settlement had been protecting them. I asked him, after a pause, who had been protecting him before the settlement. He said no one. He said the word the way an adult would say it. Then he said the next sentence in the same level voice. He said, "I want you to raise me." I had nothing prepared for that. I told him I did not know how to raise children. He told me, with the same direct certainty, that I did. He listed the things he had been told about me by the other captives: that I had healed beastfolk in another empire's clinic, that I employed orphans, that I had given guild reference letters to Bear Porter siblings 2 days ago, that I had started a soup kitchen in a country that hated my friends, that I had not killed any of the 6,000 soldiers who had invaded my grandmother's kingdom. He told me he had been listening for the things adults were proud of and the things adults were ashamed of. He had listened to what other captives had told each other about me. He had decided 3 days ago that if I came to this dungeon, he would ask. He asked. I crouched there for a few more seconds. The other 2 boys were watching me with the particular attention of children who had learned that adults' first answers were sometimes lies and who would believe what came after the first answer. I told the toddler that I was going to take everyone in this dungeon back to the surface. I told him he could come with us. I told him we could talk about the rest of it after dinner. He nodded. The other 2 boys did not relax exactly, but they breathed. Sharon, behind me, did not say anything. I would learn later that her face had done something during the toddler's speech that I had not seen. I stood up. I walked back out of the tent. Asher Shika and I activated Saintess Wish Door at the settlement's center. The settlement's leaders had been briefed. The evacuation took 6 hours. We sent every resident through to the Imperial Farm. Same destination, same protocols, same farm staff who were going to have a very busy week. The toddler walked through the door under his own power. The Demon King's son and the Beast King's son walked behind him. By the time the last evacuee passed through the door, the Lord's castle above us had, in some way I would learn about the next morning, ceased to be the Lord's castle. I would deal with all of it tomorrow. For now, I closed the door. I woke up at the Imperial Farm. I had returned to the farm with the last of the evacuees the previous night. The Saintess Wish Door had remained open until everyone had been counted, fed, and assigned somewhere to sleep. The farm staff, 500 Eternal Night subordinates Scheherazade and Ashureshika, had stationed there, plus the 20 human staff Istura had hired in the Imperial capital, had absorbed 300 new residents without complaint and with surprisingly little chaos. They had been preparing for this kind of intake since the War Village's relief operation. They had not expected the volume to triple in a single night. The farm now smelled like rice porridge. The 3 children were in the kitchen. I noticed this on my way down for breakfast. The toddler was sitting on a wooden stool that had been adjusted for his height. The Demon King's son and the Beast King's son were on either side of him. All three had bowls of porridge. The toddler was managing his with adult competence. The other two were watching him learn to eat porridge again with the kind of patient concentration that did not belong to children their ages. Timit and Sienna were also in the kitchen. They had taken charge of the children's morning meal, as if they had always been responsible for it. They were doing the things they had learned to do at the Imperial Orphanage, modeling table behavior, asking gentle questions, allowing space for the new children to not answer if they did not want to. It had been 12 hours. The toddler looked up when I came in. He did not say anything to me. He nodded once, in the way one nods at a colleague who has shown up at the office on time. Then he went back to his porridge. I sat down at the table. Ira brought me coffee. Ira had not slept either. She told me, in her professional tone, that there had been a development in the Lord's territory above the dungeon. I asked, with the particular flatness of a man who already knew approximately what the development was going to be, who had handled it. She said grandmother had handled it. She said grandmother had handled it the previous night, in approximately 7 hours, with the quiet efficiency of a fairy queen who had been waiting for a legal pretext to absorb a noble territory she had been politically eyeing for 40 years and had received that pretext when the Lord's family had begun systematically disappearing the citizens of 3 neighboring nations into a private mining operation under their floor. I asked, after a small pause, whether it had been bloody. Ira said it had not been bloody. Grandmother had taken the castle without a single fatality on either side. The Lord and his son were currently in formal Forest Kingdom custody, pending trial. The territory was being annexed by treaty. Several of the formerly imprisoned nobles in our settlement were being approached this morning with offers to repatriate to their home countries with formal Forest Kingdom letters of protection. I drank the coffee. I asked, after another small pause, what happened next. Ira told me grandmother was at the harbor. Ira told me grandmother had ordered Ashereshika to ready the ship. Ira told me grandmother was, very politely, requesting my company on the next leg of the journey. I asked where the next leg of the journey went. Ira said it went to the southern continent. I sat down with the 3 children at the farm's central pavilion an hour later. I had asked Ira and Sharon for the conversation to happen privately. They had set up a small round table under the pavilion's glass canopy. They had arranged for the table to be visible from a discreet distance so the children would feel safe. They had arranged for a tea service with 3 child-sized cups and 1 adult cup. The toddler had insisted on the adult cup. I told the 3 children, plainly, that I had a decision to make. I told them I had not been planning, this week, to acquire children. I told them my life was complicated and likely to remain complicated. I told them I traveled often, that I had political enemies on at least 2 continents, that I had a history of being arrested for things I had not been formally guilty of, and that the people who depended on me had, in the previous month, included a starving village, an underground settlement, my own grandmother's kingdom, and a woman who had been thrown into a mine for the crime of being a fox. I told them, in the same level voice, that despite all of this, I was willing to do it if they were sure. The toddler asked, before any of them spoke, whether I was certain about the difficulty. I told him I was certain. He nodded. Then he asked, with the same direct certainty, whether I would feed them. I told him I would. He asked whether I would teach them to read. I told him I would. He asked whether I would find their families if their families were still alive. I told him, after a long pause, that I would try. He asked whether I would be honest with them when I had failed at something. I told him yes. He thought about it for several seconds. Then he said, "Then I want to come." The Demon King's son looked at the toddler. The Demon King's son, who had not spoken yet, said in a quiet voice that his real father had been killed 2 years ago by a faction that had wanted his throne, and that he did not know whether he could go home, and that he was afraid of the throne even if he could. He asked, with the same quiet, whether he could come with us until he had decided. I told him yes. The Beast King's son did not speak. He looked at the other 2. He looked at me. He nodded once, very small. I told the 3 of them that I would arrange for someone to teach them to read on the journey. I told them they would each have their own room on the ship. I told them I was not, in any sense, replacing whatever family they had had, that if their families came for them at any point, in any condition, I would help reunite them, and that I would not interfere with that decision when it was made. I told them, last, that they were not employees, that they were not subordinates, and that they were not under any obligation to be useful to me. The toddler's expression went through something at that last sentence. He nodded again. He drank from the adult cup of tea, awkwardly, holding it with both small hands. He did not say anything else. I stood up. I went to find Sharon. She was in the farm's office tracking the morning's intake numbers. I told her what had been agreed. She told me, in her professional tone, that she had already prepared 3 nameplate orders for the rooms on the ship. I asked her how she had known what to prepare. She told me she had watched my face during breakfast. She had known, she said, what I was going to decide approximately 30 minutes before I had decided it. I had nothing to say to that. She did not press the point. The ship was at the harbor. We departed for the southern continent the following morning. The harbor scene was, by Sharon's word, undignified. Grandmother had arrived in formal Forest Kingdom regalia and was directing what she described as a small honor guard of sea sprites who specifically requested this assignment, and several diplomatic personnel she was calling friends. Haruto had appeared at the harbor at sunrise with a small adventuring party and had announced, with the particular cheerfulness he saved for occasions where he was about to inconvenience me, that he was joining us as far as the southern continent's first port. The northern continent adventurers in his party, including the two transmigrators, had saluted my grandmother on first sight and held the salute for an embarrassing 30 seconds before grandmother had noticed and waved them off, and Haruto had, at that moment, made a sound I had never heard him make and could not subsequently explain in words. Ashurashika's ship had been customized again. The simulated outdoor deck for the horse dragons was now larger. The reading library had a new shelf for what Scheherazade described, with a particular satisfaction, as children's primers. 3 small rooms had been prepared at the rear of the second deck. Each had a nameplate. The toddler's plate read his actual name, which I had learned at breakfast. The Demon King's son's plate read his actual name. The Beast King's son's plate read his actual name. None of those names appear in this narration because all 3 of those names are theirs and not mine to share. Timit and Sina had claimed the bunk room next to the children's 3 rooms. They had announced, separately and without coordinating, that they were going to be the children's daily companions on the journey. The toddler had objected to being treated like a child by older children. Sina had told him that was fine, but they were going to be there anyway. He had not had a counter-argument. We boarded. Grandmother stood with me at the stern as the ship pulled out of the harbor. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, that this was not how she had imagined her grandson's first journey to the southern continent. I told her I had not imagined it either. She told me we were both going to be all right. I told her I would think about it. She laughed. I went down to the lower deck. I stopped at the door of the toddler's small room. He was inside, on his bed, reading a primer Scheherazade had given him. He had not yet asked for help with the difficult words, because he did not, by the look of his progress, need help. He looked up when he sensed me. He nodded once. He went back to the book. I stood there for a moment longer. Then I went up to the dining hall, where dinner was being served, where Sharon was already at the head of the long table, negotiating with grandmother about the ship's running expenses, with a financial ledger pointed at grandmother like a polite weapon, where Haruto was complaining loudly about the lack of imported beer and being ignored by everyone, where Timit and Sienna were holding seats for the 3 royal children, where Aira was reviewing the journey's manifest, and where the empty chair at the end of the table was, by quiet protocol, mine. I sat down. The dinner was good. I should explain something. The boy in this story has, throughout his time in this world, called himself unnecessary. He has done it in his own narration. He has done it in his own thoughts. He has done it several times when he should not have been doing it. I am that boy. I still call myself unnecessary. The thought has not stopped occurring. The instinct has not been retrained. But the ship was very full. The children had already claimed the good bunks. Sharon was threatening grandmother with a financial ledger. Haruto was complaining about beer. The sea was calm. The horizon, in the direction of the southern continent, was clear. I figured I would think about it later. I had been very good at lying to myself recently. This time, the lie was kinder.